you wake in complete darkness, long before any hint of dawn touches the sky. The room around you is small and simple, a chamber built into the corner of the fort's main barracks block, with walls of rough timber and clay that hold the deep cold of the winter night. For a moment you lie still under the heavy wool blankets, feeling the weight of them pressing down on your chest, the air near your face sharp and chill. A thin rime of frost has formed on the wooden shutter that covers the single high window, and when you breathe out, a little cloud of vapor drifts upward into the blackness. No sound comes from the other side of the wall, where the garrison soldiers sleep. The whole fort is wrapped in the kind of deep silence that only a winter night can bring. You push the blankets aside slowly, feeling the cold rush in to claim the space your body had warmed. The stone floor is painful against your bare feet, so you move quickly to pull on the thick wool socks you left draped over the end of the bed frame the night before. Next comes your undertunic, a long-sleeved garment of soft, undyed wool that you tug over your head and smooth down with both hands. Over that, you fasten a heavier tunic of dark brown wool, belting it at the waist with a simple leather strap. The routine is automatic, something your fingers have done countless times in the half-light of early mornings. You sit on the edge of the bed to lace your boots, sturdy things of oiled leather with hobnails that click faintly against the stone as you pull the laces tight. A thick woolen cloak, the color of wet earth, goes over your shoulders, and you pin it at the throat with a plain iron brooch shaped like a simple roundel. Finally, you pull on a felt cap that covers your ears, because the stable can be drafty even with the doors shut. The lamp you lit before sleeping has long since burned out, so you strike a spark from a flint and steel into a handful of dried moss, coaxing a tiny flame to life in a clay dish of oil. The light pushes the shadows back a little, revealing the bare walls, the wooden chest where you keep your spare clothes, and the small clay water jug on the floor. You wash your face with a splash of the cold water, the shock of it sharpening your senses. Then dry your hands on the edge of your cloak. After a final check that your boots are properly fastened, you lift the oil lamp by its handle and open the heavy wooden door. The outside air hits your face like a cold cloth. Snow lies thick on the ground of the fort's central yard, deep enough to muffle all ordinary sounds into a kind of soft hush. The sky is still dark, but in the east, just above the line of the palisade, the faintest possible grey is beginning to bleed into the blackness, no more than a suggestion of the day to come. You can see the silhouettes of the guard towers at each corner of the fort, the square shapes of the barracks, the granary, and the command building, all sleeping under their white blankets. A single point of yellow light moves slowly along the top of the wall, where the night watchman makes his rounds, and you hear the distant sound of his iron-shod staff tapping against the frozen walkway in a slow, regular beat. Your boots sink into the snow as you walk towards the stable. Each step makes a low crunching noise that seems very loud in the quiet. The path between the buildings is barely visible, just a slight depression in the snow that you know by memory, and you follow it past the armory with its locked door, past the low bakery where no smoke yet rises from the chimney, and around the corner of the headquarters building. The cold makes the wooden timbers of the buildings creak and tick, tiny settling sounds that pop in the stillness. Above you, a few stars still show through a break in the clouds, small and distant and very white against the retreating night. The stable stands on the northern side of the fort, a long rectangular structure built of massive oak posts and planks, with a roof of thatch that overhangs the walls by a good 3 feet. Its shape is familiar to you in the way that only something you have walked towards every morning for years can be. You see the faint glow of the single lamp that burns all night just inside the main door, a small flame that keeps the deepest darkness from the horses and warns away any wild animals that might wander close. As you approach, you hear a soft thump from inside, then another, a horse shifting its weight perhaps, or shaking its head against a stall partition. The sound is comforting, a sign that the animals are resting easily. You push open the heavy side door, and at once the air changes. Outside it was dry and sharp and still. Inside it is warm and thick and alive with the mingled smells of hay, horses, old wood, and the faint tang of leather from the tack room. The warmth wraps around you like a second cloak, and you pause just inside the doorway to let your eyes adjust. The lamp on its iron bracket casts a small pool of orange light, and beyond that the stable stretches away into shadow. The long central aisle lined on both sides with the dark shapes of the stalls. You can hear the steady rhythmic breathing of the horses, a sound as regular as waves on a distant shore. You hang your own lamp on a hook near the door and go to the first lamp bracket further down the aisle. It holds a simple clay lamp with a thick wick, the oil half burned down. You lift it down carefully, tilt it to check the oil level, and then use a splint to transfer flame from your lamp. The wick catches with a small pop, and the flame steadies into a soft, rounded glow. You replace the lamp on its bracket and move to the next one, further along the wall, repeating the process. Lift, check, light, replace. There are 6 lamps in all along the length of the stable, and you light them one after the other, working slowly from one end to the other. The light spreads gradually, pushing the shadows back into the corners, revealing the details of the stable inch by inch, the grain of the wooden posts worn smooth by years of rubbing, the iron rings set into the walls for tying leads, the straw dust floating in the still air like tiny specks of gold. By the time the last lamp is lit, the whole stable glows with a warm amber light. You can see the horses now, standing in their stalls, some with heads already turned towards you, ears pricked forward with mild curiosity. They are cavalry mounts, bred and trained for endurance rather than speed, sturdy animals with broad chests and strong legs, most of them of Gallic or Spanish blood, with a few smaller local ponies mixed in. Their coats are thick with winter growth, giving them a shaggy, comfortable look, and their breath rises in little plumes from their nostrils, catching the lamplight like smoke. You take a slow, deep breath and begin your first check of the morning. This is not a hurried inspection, not the kind of quick glance a soldier might give before a patrol. It is a slow, deliberate walk along the line of stalls, an unhurried observation of each animal's state of rest. You step softly, your boots making only a whisper against the beaten earth floor, and the horses accept your presence without alarm. The first stall on your left holds a dark bay gelding with a white star on his forehead, shaped vaguely like a crescent moon. He's one of the older horses, a veteran of many summer campaigns, and he stands with a kind of patient stillness that comes from years of trust. His eyes are half closed, the long lashes almost resting on his cheeks, and his lower lip droops slightly in an expression of deep relaxation. You pause at his stall door and let your gaze travel from his ears to his hooves, noting the slow rise and fall of his barrel, the way his weight is evenly distributed on all 4 legs. He turns his head towards you just enough that the star catches the light, and you reach out to brush your knuckles gently against the soft part of his nose. His skin is warm and dry, exactly as it should be, and he exhales a long, quiet sigh that ruffles the hair on your wrist. Across the aisle, a grey mare shifts from one hind leg to the other, her iron shoes making a low clink against the stone floor. She is younger than the bay, a Spanish horse with a finely shaped head and a mane that falls in heavy, tangled locks over her neck. In the dim light, her coat looks almost silver, and the long winter hair on her belly curls slightly at the ends. She watches you with one dark, liquid eye, her ears swiveling back and forth as she tracks your movements. You notice that she has pulled a little hay from her rack and scattered it around her stall, a habit of hers that you have long since accepted. You make a mental note to sweep it up later, but for now you simply stand near her door and let her catch your scent, which she does with a long, investigative breath that makes her nostrils flare wide. Satisfied that you are who she expects, she turns back to her hay and begins to nibble at it with a slow, steady chewing motion. Further down, a chestnut gelding with a broad white blaze and 4 white socks lies stretched out in the deep straw, his legs folded under him like a foal's. This is not unusual for him. He is a horse that likes to rest fully, and you have found him lying down more often than standing at this hour. You check that his breathing is even and deep, that there is no sign of discomfort in the way he holds his head, and that the straw beneath him is dry and plentiful. His belly rises and falls in a slow rhythm, and one of his ears flicks occasionally as though he is dreaming of running through some distant field. You do not disturb him, only watch for a moment before moving on, your steps quiet and careful, so as not to startle him awake. Beside the chestnut, in the stall that shares a wooden partition, stands a tall black horse with a coat that gleams like polished jet, even in the low lamplight. He's the largest animal in the stable, a stallion of uncertain age, who carries himself with a natural dignity, his neck arched and his head held high. You've always thought that if a horse could be called proud, it would be this one. He does not lie down often, preferring to stand through the night, as if keeping watch over the others, and this morning is no different. He acknowledges your presence with a single low breath, a sound that comes from deep in his chest, but he does not turn his head. You check the water bucket hanging from its hook in the corner of his stall, and see that a thin skin of ice has formed on the surface. You break it with a quick push of your finger and watch the water ripple, then promise him silently that you will bring fresh water soon. For now, the small opening you made is enough, and he dips his muzzle into the bucket to drink in short, neat sips. The next stall belongs to a small bay mare, a local pony that the cavalry uses for pack work rather than riding. She is round-barreled and short-legged, with a thick mane that falls over her eyes in a shaggy fringe, and she is always the first to greet you in the mornings. She pushes her head over the stall door as you approach, her whiskers twitching, and she blows a gentle puff of air into your face that smells sweetly of hay and grass. You rub the flat space between her eyes, feeling the coarse hair there slide under your palm, and she closes her eyes in contentment for a long moment. Her coat is warm, and you can feel the steady beat of her pulse through the skin of her forehead. She pulls back after a moment, shakes her head once so that her mane flops wildly, and then returns to the hay rack as if the whole exchange had been entirely her idea. Opposite her, in the last stall on the right, a dappled grey gelding paws at the straw with one front hoof, a slow, rhythmic motion that he seems to do without thinking. The sound is a soft scuff, scuff against the bedding, almost hypnotic in its regularity. His dapples show faintly through his winter coat, darker grey spots against a lighter field, and his tail hangs long and untangled almost to the ground. You watch him for a little while, noticing that his pawing is not frantic but calm, the kind of movement an animal makes when it is comfortable and mildly bored. He stops after a few seconds and drops his head to the straw, lipping at a stray stalk that has escaped the hayrack, then lets it fall from his mouth with the air of a horse who has already decided that this particular piece of straw is not worth the effort. You continue down the line, passing the tack room door and the feed storage, until you reach the far end of the stable where two more stalls stand side by side. In the first, a young dun gelding, barely more than 4 years old, stands with his head turned towards the wall, his ears flopping lazily to the sides. He is still growing into his frame, his legs seeming slightly too long for his body, and his coat has a dusty, pale brown color that reminds you of dried river clay. He is the newest addition to the stable, and he still shows a little nervousness when you approach, so you keep your distance this morning, just watching the movement of his sides as he breathes, and the way his tail gives an occasional idle swish. His breathing is calm, and that is enough for now. In the final stall, an old roan gelding with a face that has gone nearly white with age dozes on his feet, his lower lip hanging loose and his eyes completely shut. You have known this horse for many years, and his face is as familiar to you as any human's. His coat is a mix of white and red-brown hairs that blend into a soft, dusty pinkish color, and his mane is thin and wispy, almost like a foal's. He does not react at all to your presence, sunk deeply into his standing sleep, and you do not try to wake him. You simply note the depth of the straw beneath him, the fullness of his hayrack, the steady bellows of his ribs, and then you move back towards the center of the stable with a feeling of quiet satisfaction. Back near the main door, you pick up your lamp again and turn in a slow circle, letting its light touch every corner of the building. The horses have settled back into their rest after your passing, and the stable is now filled with a dense, living silence made up of many small sounds, the pull of hay from racks, the whisper of straw being rearranged under heavy bodies, the occasional long exhalation of a horse shifting its weight, the steady drip of water from the corner of the roof where the heat inside has melted a little of the snow. The cold outside seems very far away, held at bay by the thick walls and the warmth rising from the animals. You take the oil flask from its shelf and go round the lamps once more, topping up the ones that have burned low during the night, trimming the wicks with a small pair of iron snips so that they burn bright and without smoke. The flame from your own lamp flickers as you move, casting dancing shadows on the rafters where spiderwebs hang in pale, dusty threads. You notice a patch of cobweb near the hayloft ladder, and make a note to sweep it down later, but the thought drifts away almost as soon as it forms, lost in the slow current of the morning's routines. At last you place your lamp on the low wooden table near the door, where a clay pot holds a handful of dried mint leaves that you sometimes add to the horse's water in warmer weather. You sit down on the three-legged stool that is your usual seat, drawing your cloak tighter around your shoulders, and you listen. The stable is fully awake now, every horse aware of the coming day, even if the sky outside remains dark. You can hear the watchman on the wall again, his staff beating a steady rhythm that blends with the horse's breathing and the faint creak of the roof timbers settling. In a short while the first real grey of dawn will creep over the palisade, and the other stable hands will arrive, and the work of feeding and mucking out will begin in earnest. But for this small, still space of time, there is only you and the horses and the quiet, golden light of the lamps holding the darkness at bay until the sun finally decides to rise. The grey light of the earliest dawn had barely begun to seep through the cracks in the stable walls when you rose from the three-legged stool and stretched your arms carefully, feeling the stiffness in your shoulders from the cold night. The lamps still burned with their soft orange glow, but their light now seemed a little thinner against the slow arrival of the day outside. A faint, pale rectangle of light outlined the stable door where the rising sun, still hidden behind the eastern hills, began to cast its first weak illumination over the snow-covered fort. The horses sensed the change as well, a subtle shift in the quality of the air and the quiet stirring of birds in the thatch above. You saw ears prick forward and heads lift from hay racks, and a few of the animals shifted their weight from one leg to another in expectation. You walked to the small alcove near the tack room where a clay pitcher of water sat overnight, and you poured a little into a shallow basin to splash on your face, clearing the last traces of sleep from your eyes. The water was so cold it stung, but it brought a welcome sharpness to your senses, and you dried your hands on a scrap of clean linen before turning your attention to the first real task of the morning, the feeding. The hay stall was located at the far end of the stable, a separate chamber built against the back wall, and closed off by a heavy wooden door that slid sideways on greased runners. You slid it open with a low rumble, revealing a space that was almost entirely dark except for the light that followed you in. The smell inside was dense and sweet, the concentrated essence of dried meadow grasses pressed into large rectangular bales that were stacked too deep against the walls. Over the summer months, the garrison had cut and cured the hay from the fields along the river valley, and now it lay in golden green blocks, waiting to be used. You stepped inside and let your eyes adjust, breathing in the dusty, sun-dried fragrance that clung to every stalk. You selected a bale that was already partially broken open from the previous day and began to pull handfuls of hay free, working methodically from one corner. The hay crackled softly as you pulled, stems snapping and leaves crumbling into small fragments that drifted to the earthen floor. You placed the handfuls into a wide, shallow basket woven from willow withies, packing the hay loosely so that it would be easy to portion out later. The work was repetitive and gentle. Reach, pull, place, reach, pull, place, the motions flowing one into the next without any need for hurry. Occasionally you paused to pick out a stem that looked too coarse, or a bit of thistle that had dried into a prickly brown knot, dropping these discards into a separate pile for burning later. When the first basket was full, you carried it out of the hay store and set it on the floor of the main aisle, then returned for a second basket. This one you filled with a slightly different mix, choosing hay from a bale that had more clover in it, the dried purple flower heads still visible as faint speckles among the yellow stalks. Some of the horses preferred this sweeter hay, and you had learned their preferences over many months of careful observation. A third basket held hay that was a little coarser, more stem than leaf, suitable for the older gelding who needed the extra roughage to keep his digestion steady during the long winter days when fresh grass was only a memory. With the hay baskets prepared, you turned next to the grain store, a small locked cupboard built into the wall near the tack room. You lifted the wooden latch and opened the door, revealing a row of clay jars sealed with waxed linen and tied with twine. Inside these jars was the crushed barley that served as a supplement to the horses' winter diet, a small ration of energy-giving grain that helped them maintain their condition through the cold months. You took out the largest jar and removed its cover, releasing the nutty, slightly sweet smell of the grain, and scooped a measured amount into a wooden pail using a tin cup that hung from a nail on the cupboard door. The cup made a soft scraping sound against the grain each time you scooped, a sound that was instantly recognized by the horses, who began to stir more actively in their stalls, a few of them giving low, eager nickers. You mixed the barley with a handful of chopped, dried apples from a smaller jar, the fruit adding a faint fruity note to the scent of the feed. The apples had been sliced and dried in the autumn, laid out on racks in the sun until they were leathery and sweet, and now they provided a small treat that the horses always welcomed. You stirred the grain and apple mixture with your fingers, feeling the cool, dry texture of the barley and the slightly tacky surface of the fruit pieces, and then you set the pail aside and began the slow process of feeding each horse in turn. You started at the stall of the dark bay gelding with the crescent moon star, lifting a generous armload of hay from the first basket and carrying it to his manger. The manger was a wooden trough built into the corner of the stall, its edges worn smooth by years of use, and you laid the hay into it carefully, spreading it so that the stems lay flat and easy to grasp. The gelding watched you with his calm, dark eyes and then lowered his head at once, lipping at the hay with a gentle, unhurried motion. You heard the first soft grinding of his teeth as he began to chew, a sound that was soon joined by similar sounds from all the stalls as you worked your way down the line. The grey Spanish mare received her hay with a brief shake of her head, as if to say that she had been waiting quite long enough already, and then she buried her muzzle deep into the fragrant pile, her delicate nostrils flaring as she sorted through the stems for the choicest pieces. You noticed that she always ate the clover first, picking it out with a delicate precision that seemed to contradict her otherwise spirited nature. Beside her, the chestnut gelding who had been lying down earlier was now on his feet, his white-socked legs planted squarely in the fresh straw, and he extended his neck over the stall door to watch your approach with undisguised interest. You gave him his portion, and he snatched a mouthful immediately, then turned away to eat in private, his jaw working side to side in the steady, hypnotic rhythm of a contented horse. The tall black stallion took his hay with his usual dignity, lowering his head only after you had stepped back from the stall door. He did not rush, did not snatch. He simply selected a single stem, drew it into his mouth with his lips, and began to chew with a slow, meditative quality that made the simple act of eating seem like a solemn ritual. You stood for a moment watching him, the smooth muscles of his jaw moving under the glossy black skin, his ears tipped slightly backwards as he concentrated on his food. Then you moved on to the small bay pony mare, who was practically dancing in her stall with impatience, her short legs shifting and her thick mane bouncing. She buried her face in the hay the moment you placed it before her, and a long, satisfied snort escaped her nostrils, sending a puff of hay dust floating into the air. The dappled grey gelding took his hay in a more measured fashion, picking out a few stems and chewing them thoroughly before reaching for more, his eyes half closed in the pleasure of the meal. The young dun, still a little uncertain, hesitated for a moment after you put the hay in his manger, circling the stall once before approaching the food. But soon he too was eating, his nervous energy forgotten. Finally the old roan gelding woke from his doze just long enough to accept his portion, and you watched with a kind of quiet fondness as his worn-down teeth worked at the softer stems you had selected for him, the muscles in his grey-white face moving with the effort of a lifetime of chewing. With the hay distributed, you returned to the pail of barley and apple mixture. This was a smaller ration, just a few handfuls per horse, and you carried the pail from stall to stall, scooping out a measured portion into a shallow wooden bowl that you emptied into each horse's feed bin. The feed bin was a small separate compartment within the manger, designed to keep the grain from being scattered among the hay, and each horse knew exactly what the sight of the pail meant. The dark bay gelding lipped eagerly at the grain, his broad tongue sweeping the barley into his mouth with surprising delicacy. The grey mare ate her portion with rapid, precise bites, her head bobbing slightly, while the chestnut buried his whole muzzle in the feed and emerged with grain dust on his blaze. The black stallion ate slowly as he did everything, each mouthful ground down thoroughly before he swallowed, and the pony mare finished her grain in what seemed like 3 enormous happy mouthfuls. The dappled grey, the young dun, and the old roan all received their shares, and you made sure to give the roan a little extra of the apple pieces, knowing he had a particular fondness for them. After the grain was gone, you collected the pail and the bowls and returned them to the cupboard, then turned your attention to the water. The buckets in the stalls had been filled the previous evening, but as you had seen earlier, a thin skin of ice had formed on several of them during the cold night. You went to the first stall, lifted the bucket from its hook, and carried it to the door where you could see the ice clearly in the growing daylight. It was a delicate crust, no thicker than a fingernail, and you broke it with a quick tap of your knuckle, the ice shattering into tiny clear shards that floated briefly before melting into the water. You swirled the bucket gently to mix the cold liquid, and then hung it back on its hook, and the dark bay gelding immediately dipped his head to drink, pulling up water in long, slow sips that made the level in the bucket drop visibly. You repeated this process for each stall, checking every bucket, breaking ice where necessary, and topping up the water from the large clay amphora that stood in the corner near the door. The amphora had been filled the night before from the well in the yard, and the water inside was so cold it made your fingers ache even through the leather of your gloves. When the buckets were full and the horses had drunk their fill, the stable settled into a new kind of quiet, the steady munching of hay filling the air like the sound of a gentle, continuous rain. You stood in the center aisle for a while, your hands resting on your hips, watching the long row of horses as they ate. The lamplight was now entirely unnecessary, the grey morning light having grown strong enough to illuminate every corner of the stable through the gaps in the walls and the one high window at the far end that faced east. You went around and extinguished the lamps one by one, pinching the wicks between your thumb and forefinger, the last curls of smoke rising like tiny black threads before fading into the air. The stable was now lit only by the natural light of day, a cold, pale illumination that made the straw look more yellow and the horses' coats more vivid in their various shades of brown, grey, black, and chestnut. The warmth inside the stable had increased slightly with the coming of the sun, but it was still cool enough that the horses' breath continued to plume in small clouds. The walls, thick as they were, kept the worst of the winter chill at bay, and the collective heat of so many large animals made the stable feel almost comfortable compared to the bitter air outside. You pulled your cloak a little looser around your shoulders and walked slowly along the stalls again, not for any inspection this time, but simply to be among the horses as they ate. The sound of their chewing was a deeply soothing thing, a sound that had been part of your mornings for as long as you could remember. Each horse chewed at its own pace, the bay gelding with a steady grinding, the grey mare with a quicker, lighter rhythm, the old roan with the slower, more deliberate motion that seemed to match the gentle rocking of his body as he shifted his weight from side to side. The dappled grey paused in his eating to lift his head and look towards the stable door, his ears swivelling forward to catch some distant sound that you could not hear. Then he gave a low, rumbling sigh and returned to his manger. The young dun had finished his grain and was now working his way through the hay, pulling out individual stems and chewing them with a concentrated expression that was almost comical in its seriousness. The pony mare had already eaten most of her hay, and was now nuzzling through the remains for any stray pieces of apple that might have fallen among the stalks, her whiskers twitching rapidly. You leaned against a wooden post near the middle of the stable and let your gaze wander idly over the scene. Hay dust hung in the shafts of grey light, swirling slowly in the air currents, and a few strands of straw clung to the rough surface of your cloak. The floor underfoot was a mixture of packed earth and scattered hay, and your boots made a soft rustling sound whenever you shifted position. The smell of the stable was now layered with the fresh green scent of the newly opened hay, and the faint warm smell of the horses' coats warming in the presence of their food. It was a smell that meant home and safety, and the slow, reliable passing of time. Outside, the fort was beginning to stir. You could hear the distant sound of voices as the garrison soldiers rose for their morning duties, the clank of a metal pot from the direction of the cookhouse, and the rhythmic scrape of a shovel clearing snow from the path to the latrines. Somewhere a rooster crowed, its call thin and distant through the cold air, and a dog barked twice before falling silent. But inside the stable, the world remained small and enclosed, a separate realm governed by the simple needs of the animals in your care. You checked the hay store again to make sure the door was properly shut. Then you swept up the few scattered stalks that had fallen in the aisle with a broom made of bundled birch twigs, the stiff bristles scratching pleasantly against the floor. The pile of sweepings was small, just a handful of hay and a little grain dust, and you scooped it up and dropped it into the straw cart for disposal later. After that, there was little to do except wait and listen, and let the horses finish their meal at their own pace, which they did with the same unhurried steadiness with which they did everything in the winter months, when time itself seemed to slow to the rhythm of their chewing. The horses have finished their morning feed, and the stable settled into that quiet, digesting calm, when the only sounds were the occasional soft snort and the slow, rhythmic swishing of tails against wooden stall partitions. You gave them a little time to rest, leaning against the center post, while the last of the grain was licked from the feed bins, and the hay racks were picked clean of the finest leaves. Then you pushed yourself upright, rolled your shoulders once to loosen them, and turned to the task that waited every morning without fail, the mucking out. The wooden fort stood in its corner near the straw cart, its handle worn smooth and dark from the grip of many hands over many seasons. You lifted it, feeling the familiar weight settle into your palms, and you rolled the handcart from its spot by the wall, positioning it in the center of the aisle, where it would be easy to reach from each stall. The cart was a simple thing, a rectangular box on two iron-bound wheels, its planks stained a deep brown from years of carrying soiled bedding out to the midden heap. It creaked softly as you moved it, a sound so ordinary that the horses did not even lift their heads. You began at the first stall, where the dark bay gelding stood with one hind leg cocked in a relaxed pose, his eyes half closed. You unlatched his stall door and slipped inside, moving slowly so he would know exactly where you were. He shifted a step sideways to make room, his iron shoes making a dull clop on the stone floor beneath the straw, and then he stood still while you set to work. The fork tines slid into the soiled bedding with a dry, rustling sound, and you lifted a heavy clump of straw that was dark with moisture and dotted with small, round droppings. The motion was a single smooth arc from floor to cart, a slight bend at the knees, the fork angled low, a push forward into the bedding, then the lift and turn, and finally the drop into the cart with a soft, muffled thump. You worked the fork again, finding the wet patches by the darker color of the straw, and each time you removed a load, the stone floor beneath became a little more visible, its gray surface cool and damp where it had been covered all night. The bay gelding watched you with a placid expression, his ears tracking the movement of the fork without any sign of concern. Once, when you moved too close to his hind leg, he simply lifted the hoof and placed it down again a few inches further away, a quiet cooperation that needed no words. You scraped the fork gently along the stone to gather the last loose bits of soiled straw, the tines making a faint grating noise, and then you stepped back and inspected the stall. The floor was clear now, the stone swept nearly clean, and the air in the stall had changed from the heavy, ammonia-tinged smell of used bedding to something cooler and more neutral. You gave the gelding a brief pat on his warm shoulder and moved out, latching the door behind you. The handcart was now holding a respectable pile of dark, damp straw, but there was room for more, so you moved to the next stall, the one belonging to the grey Spanish mare. She was a more restless animal than the bay, and she circled her stall once before settling against the far wall, her silver-grey tail flicking against her flanks. You entered and began the same rhythm. The fork pushed into the bedding, the lift, the turn, the drop into the cart. The mare's stall had a particular pattern of wetness, concentrated near the back corner where she always chose to relieve herself, and you spent a little extra time there, digging out the sodden straw, until the stone showed through clean and dark. The mare snorted softly, a puff of air that stirred the loose hairs on her neck, and then she lowered her head to sniff at the fork as you worked, her whiskers brushing the wooden handle before she decided it was nothing interesting and looked away. With the mare's stall cleared, you moved on to the chestnut gelding with the 4 white socks. He was the one who liked to lie down, and his stall always showed the imprint of his body in the straw, a flattened oval shape where his weight had pressed the bedding into the stone. This meant the soiled straw was more spread out, and you had to work the fork in a wider pattern, lifting thinner layers from all around the stall rather than digging into one deep spot. The chestnut stood patiently near the door, his head hanging low in a posture of utter relaxation, and he did not stir even when the fork scraped close to his front hooves. You made several trips from different corners of the stall, gathering the used bedding into neat forkfuls, and the cart began to fill up noticeably, the pile rising above the sides in a dark, steaming mound. The tall black stallion's stall was next, and he was the only horse who seemed to regard the mucking out as a minor intrusion on his dignity. He did not move aside as you entered. Instead, he stood exactly where he was, his great dark head turned to watch you with one shining eye. You worked around him carefully, sliding the fork between his legs when necessary, and he tolerated this with a long, slow exhalation that ruffled the straw at his feet. His bedding was surprisingly tidy, the soiled areas concentrated in a neat corner, as if he made an effort to keep his living space orderly. You cleared it away quickly, and the stallion stepped aside at last when you needed to reach the very back, moving with a ponderous grace that made the straw whisper under his hooves. By the time you finished the black horse's stall, the handcart was nearly full, so you set the fork aside and wheeled the cart slowly down the aisle towards the small rear door that opened onto the midden yard. The wheels bumped over the packed earth floor, and the cart creaked with each revolution, a low rhythmic sound that matched your steady walking pace. You pushed the door open with your shoulder, and a blast of cold outside air swept into the stable, sharp and clean and entirely different from the warm, thick atmosphere inside. You stepped out just long enough to tip the cart's load onto the midden heap, where the soiled straw joined the pile from previous days in a dark, steaming mound that would eventually be spread on the garrison's vegetable plots come spring. The cold bit at your cheeks and made your breath plume, but you did not linger. Within moments you were back inside, pulling the door shut and rolling the empty cart to its place. Now came the second half of the task, the part that always made the stable feel renewed, bringing in the fresh straw. The straw store was a lean-to shed attached to the outer wall of the stable, accessible through a low door that you had to stoop to pass through. Inside, the bales of straw were stacked high, their golden color vivid even in the dim light, and the air was filled with the clean, dry scent of cut grain stalks, a smell that reminded you of the harvest fields under the late summer sun. You broke open a fresh bale with a quick twist of the twine that bound it, and the compressed straw sprang apart in a small explosion of gold, the individual stalks separating and fluffing up as if glad to be free. You gathered an armload, cradling it against your chest, and carried it back into the stable. The dark bay gelding was first again. You entered his stall and dropped the armload in the center, then knelt down to spread it evenly across the stone floor. The fresh straw crackled and rustled as you worked it with your hands, pushing it into the corners, building up a thicker layer where the stone was coldest, near the outer wall. You kicked at the edges with the side of your boot, stuffing the straw firmly into the gaps where the floor met the wall, and the gelding watched this with mild curiosity before lowering his head to lip at a particularly fluffy stalk. The clean, bright smell of the new straw rose around you, crisp and faintly sweet, erasing the last traces of the night's odors and leaving the stall smelling like a summer field. In the grey mare's stall, you spread the straw with a little extra care because she tended to paw at her bedding and scatter it if it was not packed down enough. You pressed the straw flat with the palms of your hands, compressing it into a dense, soft mat that would stay in place even under her restless feet, and you made sure the layer was especially thick in the back corner where she liked to stand. The mare approved of this by immediately walking to that corner and turning in a tight circle, testing the bed with her front hooves before settling into a comfortable stance. The chestnut gelding received an even deeper bed than the others because he was a horse who loved to lie down, and you wanted him to have plenty of cushion between his body and the cold stone. You brought 2 full armloads for his stall, spreading the first layer evenly, and then piling the second layer slightly higher in the center where he usually settled for the night, creating a soft mound that would cradle his weight and keep the chill from seeping into his bones. He seemed to understand what you were doing, for he walked over to the mound and sniffed it thoroughly, then gave a low, rumbling nicker that might have been satisfaction. The black stallion stall was bedded with the same deep, even layer you used for all the horses, spread smoothly across the stone without any particular mounds or hollows because he preferred a uniform surface. You took your time in his stall, knowing that he appreciated neatness, and you ran your hand over the straw after you had spread it to check for any hidden lumps that might press against his ribs when he lay down. Finding none, you stood up and dusted the straw fragments from your tunic, and the stallion gave a slow blink that was as close to thanks as he ever came. The small pony mare was next, and she made the task more interesting by trying to eat the fresh straw while you were still spreading it. You had to push her nose gently aside more than once, and she responded by blowing a puff of air into your hair and then lipping at the sleeve of your tunic, looking for treats. Her stall was smaller than the others, matching her size, so the work went quickly, and soon she was standing in a thick golden bed that made her shaggy brown coat look almost regal by contrast. The dappled grey gelding and the young dun both received their fresh straw in turn, and you worked with the same patient rhythm, spreading and smoothing and tucking the straw into corners. The young dun watched the process with his usual wariness, staying pressed against the far wall until you were done, and then he ventured forward to sniff for the new bedding with a long investigative breath that made the straw shift under his nostrils. At last you came to the old roan gelding with the white face, the horse who needed the most careful attention of all. His stall took twice as long as any other, because you wanted his bed to be perfect. You brought 3 armloads of straw instead of 2, and you knelt on the cold stone to spread it with your hands, building up a thick, soft, springy layer that would protect his aging joints from the hard floor. You paid special attention to the spot where he always lay down, near the stall door where he could watch the aisle, and you piled the straw there until it was almost a handspan deep, a soft nest that would support his old bones through the long winter night. The roan stood beside you as you worked, his head low, his cloudy eyes half closed, and once you felt him rest his muzzle gently on your shoulder, a feather-like touch that lasted only a moment before he pulled away. You smoothed the last of the straw, patted his neck where the roan hairs were thin and soft, and then you left his stall and latched the door with a quiet click. When all the stalls were freshly bedded, you stood in the aisle and surveyed your work. The stable had transformed in the span of an hour from a place that smelled of night and sleep to a place that smelled of harvest and clean earth. The fresh straw glowed softly under the grey winter light from the high window, and the horses stood or lay in their stalls with the contented air of animals who knew they were well looked after. A few stray stalks had fallen into the aisle during the work, so you picked up the birch broom again and swept them into a small pile, then scooped them into the straw cart along with the last fragments from the earlier cleaning. The broom made its gentle scratching sound against the floor, a sound that blended with the low murmur of the horses shifting and the distant, muffled noises of the fort going about its daily business. You wheeled the cart out to the mitten one more time, and when you returned you hung the fort back on its hook and pushed the cart into its corner, where it would wait until the next day. Then you walked the length of the stable, breathing in the clean, crisp air, and feeling the slight tiredness in your arms from the work, a tiredness that was not unpleasant, but simply the natural result of a task done steadily and well. The horses were quiet now, some standing in their fresh beds, others already lowering themselves down to test the softness of the straw, and you felt the same quiet satisfaction that came every morning when the stalls were clean and the animals comfortable. The morning mucking out was finished, and the fresh straw lay golden and deep in every stall, filling the stable with its clean, sun-dried scent. You brushed the last bits of straw from your tunic and walked to the tack room, a small chamber at the end of the stable that smelled of leather, oil, and the faint, pleasant mustiness of old wool saddle pads. This was where the grooming tools were kept, hanging from wooden pegs on the wall in a neat row, the curry combs, the stiff dandy brushes, the soft body brushes, the mane and tail combs, and the curved hoof picks, each one worn smooth by daily use. You selected the curry comb first, a flat oval of curved metal with short, blunt teeth, set in concentric rings. Its handle was made of wood, shaped to fit the palm, and the metal was cool against your fingers as you lifted it from its peg. Next you took the stiff brush, a rectangular block of wood densely packed with coarse bristles that were slightly yellowed at the tips from years of working through dusty coats. You tucked both tools into the wide pocket of your tunic and then picked up the hoof pick, a simple iron hook with a wooden grip, its tip blunted from scraping out countless hooves over countless mornings. These 3 tools were all you would need for the first part of the grooming, and you carried them back into the main aisle, laying them on the low wooden table near the door while you decided where to begin. The stable was calm and quiet now, the horses settling into the slow digestive peace that followed their breakfast. Some stood with their heads low, lower lips drooping, eyes half closed in the drowsy warmth of the indoor air. Others shifted idly, a hind hoof cocked, ears swiveling to track your movements. The lamps still burned, their flames steady and golden, though the light outside had strengthened enough that the high window showed a pale rectangle of grey sky, featureless and still, promising more snow before nightfall. The sound of melting snow dripping from the roof had become a steady, intermittent tick, a background rhythm that blended with the horse's breathing. You decided to start with the dark bay gelding, the dependable old soldier with the crescent moon star. He stood in his fresh bedding with his usual patient stillness, one ear tipped towards you as you approached. You unlatched the stall door, stepped inside, and ran your hand along his neck in greeting. His coat was warm under your palm, the short winter hair thick and dense, and he responded to the touch by leaning into it ever so slightly, a soft pressure that spoke of trust. You took the curry comb from your pocket and began. The curry comb moved in small circles against the bay's neck, the metal teeth pressing lightly through the hair to reach the skin beneath. You worked slowly, methodically, starting just behind his ears and moving down the curve of his neck, each circle overlapping the last so that no patch of skin was missed. The motion was repetitive and soothing, your wrist turning in a steady rhythm that soon became automatic. Dirt and dust and tiny flakes of dried skin lifted from the coat in a fine haze, catching the lamplight and swirling like gold motes before settling back into the straw. The bay gelding closed his eyes entirely, his head dropping a fraction lower, and a long, deep sigh escaped his nostrils, the sound of a horse releasing tension he did not even know he held. You worked the curry comb over his shoulder and down his foreleg, though the legs were better suited to the stiff brush, and you switched tools after a few minutes, trading the metal comb for the rectangular brush. Its bristles were firm but not harsh, and you began to brush in long, sweeping strokes that followed the direction of the hair, from neck to shoulder, from shoulder to barrel, from barrel to flank. Each stroke lifted more dust, the particles hanging in the air like a fine, dry mist, and the gelding's coat began to emerge from its winter dullness, the dark brown hairs taking on a supple, healthy shine. You brushed under his belly, where the hair was softer and the skin a little more sensitive, and he lifted his head and swung it around to watch you with a mild, questioning expression, as if to ask whether this was really necessary. It was, and you continued without hurry, the brush strokes blending one into the next, until his whole body had been worked over. When the brushing was done, you ran your hand over his coat to feel for any remaining roughness, and finding none, you turned your attention to his hooves. You moved to his left foreleg and ran your hand down the back of the cannon bone, squeezing gently just above the fetlock, the signal for him to lift his foot. He shifted his weight onto the other 3 legs and raised the hoof without hesitation, placing it in your waiting palm. The hoof was cool and hard, the iron shoe firmly attached, and you reached for the hoof pick. With the point of the pick, you worked around the edge of the frog, the soft triangular pad in the center of the hoof, clearing out the packed straw and a little dried mud that had accumulated overnight. The material came away in small, dark clumps that you dropped onto the stone floor, and you scraped gently along the cleft of the frog, the pick making a soft, scraping sound that echoed faintly in the stall. The gelding stood perfectly still, his leg relaxed, his weight trusting, and when the hoof was clean, you lowered it gently to the floor and moved to the next leg. You repeated the process 3 more times, lifting each hoof, cleaning the frog and the sole, checking the iron shoe for looseness or wear. The shoes were all sound, the nails tight in their holes, the metal only slightly worn at the toes where the horse had a tendency to drag his feet a little when he walked. You made a mental note to mention it to the farrier the next time he came through the fort, but it was nothing urgent, just the slow wearing down of iron against stone that was as natural as the passing of days. When all 4 hooves were clean, you gave the gelding a final pat on his warm shoulder and left his stall, latching the door behind you. Next was the grey Spanish mare, who had been watching the entire process with her ears pricked forward, her dark eyes bright with curiosity. She did not wait for you to come to her. Instead, she met you at the stall door and pushed her nose against your chest, sniffing at the currycomb that still dangled from your fingers. You let her investigate it, turning it over so she could see the metal teeth, and she lipped at it briefly before losing interest and stepping back to allow you inside. Her coat was finer than the bay's, the individual hairs lighter and softer, and the winter growth had given her a thick, almost plush texture that was pleasant to the touch. You began the currycomb circles on her neck, and she immediately stretched her head forward, arching her neck in a posture of pure enjoyment, her upper lip twitching. The grey mare loved to be groomed, and she made her pleasure known through a series of small contented noises, a low grunt, a soft nicker, a deep rumbling sigh that came from somewhere deep in her barrel. You worked the currycomb over her neck and shoulders, then switched to the stiff brush and began the long sweeping strokes down her body. Her silver-grey coat was naturally light, so the dust and dander showed less against it, but you could still see the fine cloud of particles that rose with each stroke, and the brush soon became coated in a thin film of pale grey dust that you tapped out against the stall partition. The mare's mane, a heavy cascade of dark grey and white hairs, was tangled in its usual fashion, and you made a mental note to work through it with the main comb later, for now simply running the brush over the top of her neck where the mane fell and smoothing down the worst of the tangles with your fingers. When you reached her hooves, she was less cooperative than the bay, lifting each foot, only after a moment's hesitation and leaning her weight against you in a way that made the task more laborious. You steadied her leg against your thigh as you always did, and she eventually relented, allowing you to clean each hoof in turn. Her shoes were newer than the geldings, the iron still showing the faint file marks from the last shoeing, and the nails were all tight and secure. You scraped out a surprising amount of straw from one hind hoof, a dense wad that she must have packed in while circling her stall, and when you dropped the leg, she stamped it once on the floor as if to test the new lightness. The chestnut gelding with the 4 white socks was dozing when you entered his stall, his head low and his eyes shut, but he woke as soon as he felt the curry comb touch his shoulder. He was a horse who enjoyed grooming with a quiet, unassuming gratitude, standing perfectly still while you worked the comb in circles over his rich red-brown coat. The white of his socks showed up brilliantly against the darker hair, and you brushed each leg with extra care, the stiff bristles sending up little puffs of dust from the feathering around his fetlocks. His hooves were a pale horn color, almost white, which made it easy to see the dirt packed into the clefts, and you cleaned each one thoroughly while he dozed on his feet, his breathing slow and deep. The tall black stallion presented a different kind of task. His coat was like polished jet, so dark that it seemed to absorb the lamplight rather than reflect it, and the dust that rose from the curry comb showed as a pale grey against his black skin. You worked the comb in small, careful circles, and he stood with his head high, his neck arched, accepting the grooming as if it were a tribute he was owed. The stiff brush followed, and you brushed his coat until it gleamed with a deep, liquid shine, the hair lying flat and smooth from neck to tail. His mane was long and thick, a cascade of black that fell over his arched neck like a waterfall, and you picked out the few tangles with your fingers rather than the comb, knowing he was sensitive about his mane being pulled. When you reached his hooves, he lifted each foot with a ponderous dignity, holding the leg up as if he were doing you a favor, and you cleaned the hooves quickly, noting that his shoes were the largest in the stable, heavy things of forge blackened iron that clinked softly when you set them down. The small pony mare was next, and grooming her was always a lively affair. She was too short for you to comfortably reach her back without stooping, so you knelt beside her in the deep straw, working the curry comb over her round, shaggy body. Her coat was thick and coarse, almost like a bear's fur, and the comb raised clouds of dust that made you turn your head away to sneeze. She tolerated the grooming with a cheerful impatience, nibbling at your sleeve, nudging your shoulder with her nose, and once, when you were brushing her belly, she turned her head and blew a puff of warm breath directly into your ear. Her hooves were small and neat, the shoes tiny in comparison to the cavalry mounts, and you picked them out quickly while she leaned her weight against you in a friendly, companionable way. The dappled grey gelding had a coat that was a study in subtle patterns, the dark grey spots standing out against a lighter grey background in a way that reminded you of the shadows cast by leaves on a forest floor. You brushed him slowly, enjoying the way the dapples seemed to shift and change as the hair lay flat in one direction and then another. He was a calm, undemanding horse, and he stood with one ear cocked towards you, the other swiveling lazily to catch the sounds of the stable around him. His hooves were a darker horn color than the chestnuts, and they held the dirt more stubbornly, requiring a little extra scraping around the frog before they were clean. The young dun gelding required a gentler approach. He still carried a trace of nervousness in the way he watched you, his pale brown eyes wide and his ears flicking rapidly back and forth. You moved slowly, letting him see the curry comb, letting him sniff it, and you began the grooming on his shoulder rather than his neck, working in small light circles that barely pressed into the skin. Gradually, as the familiar sensation registered, he relaxed, his head lowering and his breathing slowing, and by the time you switched to the stiff brush, he was standing with his eyes half closed, one hind leg cocked, the picture of a horse at ease. His coat was a dusty brown, the color of dry river clay, and it had a soft, almost velvety texture that was pleasant under your hand. You brushed him carefully, avoiding the areas where the tack had rubbed a little during the last training session, and you made a mental note to check the fit of his saddle before it was used again. His hooves were still growing into their full adult size, the horn a little softer than the older horses, and you cleaned them with extra gentleness, not wanting to startle him with the pick. Finally, you came to the old roan gelding with the face that had gone nearly white. He was dozing when you entered his stall, his head hanging low and his eyes closed, and he did not wake until you touched his neck with the flat of your hand. He startled slightly, then recognized you and gave a low, wheezy nicker, his whiskered muzzle brushing against your arm. You groomed him with a tenderness that came from years of knowing him, the curry comb moving in slow, light circles over his thin old coat, careful not to press too hard against the ribs that were more prominent now than they had been in his younger days. His roan color had faded with age, the red-brown hairs growing sparser, and the white hairs increasing until his coat looked like a dusting of snow on autumn leaves. The stiff brush was almost too harsh for his sensitive skin, so you used it sparingly, mostly along his neck and shoulders where the hair was thickest, and for the rest of his body you simply ran your hands over the coat, smoothing down the rough spots with your palms. His hooves were worn and chipped, the shoes showing the most wear of any horse in the stable, and you made a note to have the farrier look at them soon. You cleaned each hoof with care, supporting his weight when he seemed unsteady, and when you were done, he gave a long, shuddering sigh and lowered himself slowly to the fresh straw, folding his legs under him with a creakiness that spoke of old joints and long years. When all the horses were groomed, you carried the tools back to the tack room and hung them on their pegs. The curry comb was dulled with dust, the brush bristles clogged with fine grey particles, and you would clean them later, but for now they could rest. You walked back into the aisle and stood for a moment, listening to the quiet sounds of the stable, the soft rustle of horses shifting in their straw, the steady drip of melting snow from the roof, the distant clank of the blacksmith's hammer from across the fort. The horses were clean and comfortable, their coats lying flat and smooth, their hooves free of packed debris, and the stable held that particular deep peace that always followed a thorough grooming. The sun had climbed high enough by mid-morning that the grey light through the high window had brightened into a pale, watery yellow, though the air outside remained bitter cold and the snow on the roof showed no sign of melting beyond the slow drip that had been going on since dawn. The horses had rested after their grooming, some standing quietly, others lying in the deep straw with their legs folded beneath them, and the stable had settled into that particular stillness that came between the morning chores and the midday tasks. You spent the interval on the low stool near the door, a clay cup of warm barley water cradled in your hands, its heat seeping through the pottery into your cold fingers, the steam rising in a thin ribbon that curled and vanished in the dim air. When the cup was empty and the warmth had spread through your chest, he set it aside and stood up, knowing it was time for the next part of the day's rhythm, the watering. The horses had drunk from their buckets throughout the morning, but the buckets were small, meant for stall-side sipping rather than a full, deep drink, and it was your practice to lead them to the main trough in the yard once a day so they could fill their bellies with fresh, cold water. This was as much for their health as for their spirits, a chance to stretch their legs and breathe the outside air, even if only for a short while. You pulled your heavy cloak tighter around your shoulders and fastened the pin more securely at your throat, then took 2 leather-led ropes from their hooks by the door. The leads were long and supple, dark brown from years of oiling, with brass clips on the ends that clicked open and shut with a smooth, solid action. You tested each clip with your thumb, making sure the springs were working properly, and then you walked to the first stall, where the dark bay gelding lifted his head at your approach, his ears pricking forward with the mild interest of a horse who knows something is about to happen. You clipped the lead to his halter and unlatched the door, and he followed you out into the aisle with his usual calm obedience, his large hooves making soft, muffled thuds on the packed earth floor. Next you stopped at the grey Spanish mare's stall, and she was already waiting at the door, her silver-grey head extended over the top rail, her nostrils flaring as she caught the scent of the cold outside air that had crept in when you opened the far door earlier. You clipped the second lead to her halter, and she stepped out eagerly, her neck arched and her tail lifted slightly in a small display of energy. With a horse on each side, you walked them slowly down the aisle towards the main stable door, their heads bobbing gently with the rhythm of their walk, the leads held loosely in your hands. The main door was a heavy construction of oak planks bound with iron straps, and it took a good push with your shoulder to swing it open. The moment the gap widened, the outside air rushed in like a wave, cold and sharp and so clean it made your lungs ache with the first breath. The light was dazzling after the dimness of the stable, a bright white glare from the snow that covered every surface in the yard, and you squinted against it as you led the horses through the doorway and into the open. The yard was a broad, flat space at the center of the fort, its usual beaten earth surface buried under a layer of snow that came up past your ankles and crunched loudly under your boots with every step. The snow was not fresh. It had fallen 2 days ago and had since been trampled and packed in places, but a light dusting had come during the night and laid a clean, soft layer over the older crust. The roofs of the surrounding buildings wore thick white caps, and the palisade walls had a fringe of icicles hanging from the tips of the pointed logs, each one catching the pale sunlight and glinting like a shard of glass. The sky above was a uniform pale grey, featureless and flat, promising more snow before the day was done. You led the 2 horses across the yard towards the watering trough, which stood near the well in the center of the open space. The trough was a long rectangular basin carved from a single block of grey stone, its sides worn smooth by the rubbing of countless muzzles over the years, its rim rounded and slightly hollowed in places where the horses habitually rested their chins. The water inside was dark and still, and as you drew closer, you saw that a crust of ice had formed across the entire surface, thin at the edges where the stone held a little residual warmth from the day before, but thicker in the center where the cold had bitten deepest. You tied the lead ropes loosely around the iron ring set into the end of the trough, giving the horses enough slack to reach the water, but not so much that they could tangle themselves. Then you walked around to the side and picked up the wooden paddle that lay on the stone rim, its handle wrapped with twine for grip, its wide flat blade scarred and water-stained from constant use. You leaned over the trough and began to break the ice. The paddle struck the crust with a sharp, splintering crack that echoed across the quiet yard, and the ice broke into angular pieces that slid across the dark water surface, bumping against each other with a sound like chipped glass. You worked the paddle in a sweeping motion, pushing the broken shards to one end of the trough where they could be scooped out easily, and then you scooped them with the flat of the blade and tossed them onto the snow beside the trough, where they lay glittering like fragments of a broken mirror. The water underneath was black and clean and so cold it seemed to steam faintly where the air touched it, a low mist rising from the surface and drifting away in thin wisps. With the ice cleared and the water open, you stepped back and picked up the lead ropes again. The bay gelding needed no encouragement. He lowered his head at once and dipped his muzzle into the trough, and you heard the soft gurgle of water being drawn into his mouth, a sound so familiar and ordinary that it was almost like hearing your own breathing. He drank in long, slow draughts, pulling the water up with a steady rhythm, his throat moving in visible swallows, his ears flopping lazily forward as he concentrated on the simple pleasure of drinking. Bubbles rose from his nostrils and popped on the surface, sending tiny ripples that spread outward in perfect circles until they faded against the stone sides. The grey mare was more particular. She sniffed at the water first, her delicate nostrils flaring wide, and then she blew a soft breath across the surface, making the ripples dance and shiver before she finally lowered her head and began to drink. Her sips were smaller and quicker than the gelding's, a series of neat, precise mouthfuls that she took with her eyes half closed, the long lashes resting against her silver-grey cheeks. You stood between them, holding the leads loosely, your breath pluming in the cold air, and you let your gaze wander across the yard while the horses drank. The fort was going about its morning business around you, quiet and unhurried. A soldier walked past the granary with a sack of grain over his shoulder, his boots leaving deep prints in the snow, and he raised a hand in silent greeting before disappearing around the corner of the barracks. 2 other soldiers stood near the armory, talking in low voices that you could not quite make out, their breath hanging in front of their faces in small, rapid clouds. From the direction of the cookhouse, a thin column of grey smoke rose straight up into the still air, carrying with it the faint smell of wood smoke and something cooking, perhaps barley porridge or the morning's bread. A raven sat on the peak of the headquarters roof, a black shape against the pale sky, and it watched the yard with its head tilted, occasionally letting out a low, guttural croak that echoed off the walls. The bay gelding finished drinking and lifted his head, water dripping from his muzzle in a slow, steady patter that dotted the snow at his feet with small dark holes. He gave a long, satisfied sigh and shook his head once, sending a fine spray of droplets through the air that glittered for an instant before vanishing into the snow. Then he stood quietly, his lead rope slack, his eyes half closed, looking out across the yard with the calm patience of a horse who had done this 1,000 times before and expected to do it 1,000 times more. The grey mare drank for a while longer, taking her time as she always did, and then she too lifted her head and turned to look at you with water still clinging to the whiskers on her chin. She lipped at the air, tasting the cold, and then she stretched her neck forward and touched her nose gently to the bay gelding's shoulder, a brief companionable contact that seemed to say something in a language only horses understood. The gelding did not react except to flick one ear in her direction, and then both of them stood side by side, their breath mingling in a single cloud that rose and dissipated in the cold air. You gave them a few more moments, letting the water settle in their bellies, and then you untied the leads from the ring and began the slow walk back towards the stable. The snow was deeper near the doorway where no one had walked since the last flurry, and the horses stepped high through it, their hooves lifting and falling in a steady, deliberate rhythm. The crunch of the snow underfoot was loud in the quiet yard, a crisp, rhythmic sound that matched the pace of your walking, and you found yourself counting the steps without meaning to, a habit you had picked up over long winters spent doing repetitive tasks. Back inside the stable, the warmth wrapped around you again like a familiar blanket. The contrast with the outside air made your cheeks tingle and your fingers ache as the blood returned to them, and you rubbed your hands together briskly before leading the two horses back to their stalls. The bay gelding walked into his stall without prompting, turned a slow circle in the fresh straw, and then settled into his usual position with his head over the door, watching the aisle. The grey mare did the same, though she paused to nose at her hayrack first, checking to see if any choice stems had magically appeared while she was gone. Finding none, she gave a small, resigned snort and turned to face the door, her ears pricked forward as if waiting to see what would happen next. You returned the lead ropes to their hooks, and then walked back outside to check the trough, making sure the paddle was in its place, and the ice shards had not blown back into the water. The yard was still and quiet, the raven gone from its perch, the two soldiers disappeared into some doorway. The trough water was already forming a new skin of ice at the edges where it touched the cold stone, a delicate transparent film that would thicken as the afternoon wore on. He pushed it aside with the paddle once more, breaking it before it could set, and then you turned back towards the stable. The second pair of horses was ready for their turn. You took up the leads again and walked to the chestnut gelding stall, where he was lying down in his deep bed of straw, his 4 white-socked legs tucked neatly beneath him. He opened his eyes when you unlatched the door, and looked at you with an expression that suggested he had been quite comfortable, and was not entirely sure he wanted to move. You waited, patient, and after a long moment he pushed himself up with a grunt, the straw clinging to his coat in a scattering of golden flecks, and he came to the door to accept the lead. The tall black stallion was already standing, his head high, his dark eyes watching the aisle, and he stepped out when you opened his door with the same measured dignity he brought to every activity. You led the two horses out into the yard, their hooves punching deep holes in the snow, the cold air striking their coats and making the stallion lift his tail and arch his neck in a brief, spirited display. The chestnut was less demonstrative. He plodded along beside you with his head low, his breath coming in steady white puffs, his expression one of patient endurance. At the trough, you tied them to the ring and broke the new ice that had formed, the paddle making the same sharp cracking sound, the shards skittering across the dark water before you scooped them out. The stallion drank first, lowering his great black head with a slow, deliberate motion, and his long, deep draughts made the water level drop visibly. The chestnut joined him after a moment, drinking with a steady, rhythmic gulping that was loud in the quiet yard, and you stood between them as you had with the first pair, the leads held loosely, your gaze drifting across the familiar shapes of the fort. When they had drunk their fill, you led them back inside and returned them to their stalls, the warmth of the stable folding around them as they settled back into the straw. The small pony mare and the dappled grey were next, the pony practically bouncing through the snow on her short legs, her thick coat making her look like a round, shaggy ball, while the dappled grey walked with his usual calm composure. You broke the ice a third time, the paddle now wet and cold in your grip, and the pony drank so eagerly that water splashed over the rim of the trough and froze almost instantly on the stone. The grey drank more sedately, his dappled coat looking almost silver in the pale light, and when he was done he lifted his head and stood gazing out towards the gate of the fort as if he could see something beyond the walls that no one else could see. The last pair was the young dun gelding and the old roan. The dun was nervous about the snow, lifting his feet high with each step and snorting at the cold air, but he calmed when he saw the trough and smelled the water, and he drank after only a brief hesitation. The old roan walked slowly, his joints stiff from the cold despite the warmth of the stable, and you kept the pace deliberately slow to match his steps. At the trough he drank for a long time, longer than any of the others, his old grey-white muzzle submerged nearly to the eyes, and when he finally lifted his head, he gave a long, shuddering sigh that was so deep it seemed to come from the very bottom of his old bones. You let them both back inside, the dun settling quickly into his stall while the roan took his time, circling once, twice, before finally lowering himself down into the straw with a creak and a groan. With all the horses watered and returned to their stalls, you closed the main stable door and pushed the latch into place, shutting out the cold. The stable was quiet again, the horses resting after their brief excursion, and you hung the lead ropes back on their hooks, the leather still cold from the outside air. You stood for a moment in the center aisle, listening to the peaceful sounds of the animals settling back into their winter routines. And then you walked to the stool by the door and sat down, pulling your cloak around you against the chill that had crept in during the watering. The midday watering was done, and the horses had settled back into their stalls with a heavy, contented stillness that follows a deep drink of cold water. The stable was quiet now, the only sounds the occasional rustle of straw and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the animals at rest. Outside, the pale sun had climbed to its highest point, a dim white disk barely visible through the grey overcast, casting a flat, shadowless light across the snowy yard. You stood in the center aisle for a moment, letting the warmth of the stable seep back into your bones after the cold of the yard, and then you turned towards the tack room, where a different kind of work was waiting. The tack room was a small chamber built into the corner of the stable, just large enough for a workbench, a low stool, and several wooden pegs and racks where the riding equipment was stored. Its walls were lined with planks of smooth planed timber, and the single narrow window near the ceiling let in a thin shaft of grey light that fell diagonally across the workbench, illuminating the dust motes that drifted lazily in the still air. The smell in this room was different from the rest of the stable. A dense, rich blend of oiled leather, warm beeswax, and the faint metallic tang of iron from the bit fittings and buckle tongues. It was a smell that spoke of careful maintenance and long hours of quiet work. On the workbench lay a saddle that you had brought in the day before, a cavalry saddle of the standard pattern, its wooden frame covered with thick oxhide that had been shaped and stitched by a craftsman in some distant workshop many years ago. The leather was a deep, dark brown, almost black in the creases, and it showed the marks of long use, a polished shine on the seat where the rider's weight had pressed, faint scuff marks on the pommel and cantle, and a worn patch on the left side where the rider's leg had rubbed against it during countless hours of riding. The saddle sat on the bench like an old friend, familiar in every line and curve, and you ran your hand over the seat as you approached, feeling the cool, smooth surface of the leather under your palm. The problem with the saddle was easy to see. One of the leather straps that secured the girth had begun to fray, its edges softening and splitting into thin, fibrous strands that would soon give way entirely if left unrepaired. The stitching along the strap was also loose in places, the waxed linen thread pulling away from the holes where the needle had passed through, leaving small gaps that weakened the whole assembly. It was a common kind of wear, the sort of thing that happened gradually over months of use until one day you noticed it and knew it could not be put off any longer. You sat down on the low stool, a sturdy three-legged seat that had been made from a single block of beechwood, its surface hollowed slightly by the weight of all the people who had sat on it before you. The stool creaked softly as you settled onto it, a familiar, comfortable sound. From the shelf above the bench, he took down the tools you would need, a bone awl with a sharp, polished point, a wooden-handled knife with a short curved blade for trimming leather, a small clay pot of beeswax mixed with tallow, and a ball of waxed linen thread that was the color of pale honey. You laid these out on the bench in a neat row, each tool within easy reach, and then you lifted the saddle and turned it over so that the underside faced up, exposing the worn strap and the loose stitching. The first task was to remove the damaged thread. You took the knife and worked the tip carefully under one of the loose stitches, lifting the thread just enough to slip the blade beneath it. The old thread was stiff with dried wax and dirt, and it parted with a faint, dry snap as you cut through it, the ends springing back from the leather. You worked your way along the length of the strap, cutting each stitch one by one, the knife making a soft, precise sound each time it sliced through the thread. When all the old stitches were cut, you pulled the remnants of thread from the holes with your fingers, the fragments coming away in small twisted pieces that you dropped into a clay bowl on the corner of the bench. The leather strap was now free, attached to the saddle only at its base, and you could see the full extent of the damage. The edges were rough and feathered, and a few of the stitch holes had elongated into small slits from the strain of use. You picked up the knife again and trimmed the frayed edges of the strap, cutting away the loose fibers with slow, careful strokes that left a clean, even edge. The leather was thick and resistant, and you had to bear down with a steady pressure to make each cut, the blade drawing through the hide with a smooth, whispery sound. The trimmed fragments fell onto the bench in small, dark curls, and when you were done, the strap looked neater, its edges crisp and straight, ready for new stitching. Now came the beeswax. You opened the clay pot and dipped 2 fingers into the soft golden mixture, scooping out a small amount that you worked between your palms until it was warm and pliable. Then you ran the wax along the edges of the strap, smoothing it into the cut surfaces, sealing the fibers so that moisture could not creep in and rot the leather from within. The wax left a faint, glossy sheen on the dark hide and released a sweet honeyed scent that mixed pleasantly with the leather smell of the room. You also waxed a length of the new linen thread, drawing it through the pot and pinching off the excess with your fingers, leaving it coated and slightly tacky, ready for stitching. The bone awl was next. You picked it up and turned it over in your hand, feeling the smooth, cool surface of the polished bone, the handle worn to fit the grip of many fingers. With the awl, you began to punch new stitch holes along the trimmed edge of the strap, aligning them carefully with the old holes in the saddle body beneath. The awl point pierced the leather with a firm, steady pressure, making a soft popping sound as it broke through the hide and emerged on the other side. You worked slowly, spacing the holes evenly, each one exactly the same distance from the edge and from its neighbors. The rhythm was repetitive and calming. Position the awl. Push, withdraw, move forward, position, push, withdraw. Each hole was a small, neat circle in the dark leather, and when you were done, the strap was ready to be stitched back into place. You threaded the waxed linen through a heavy iron needle, the eye just large enough to accept the thick thread, and you began to stitch. The needle went into the first hole with a slight push, the point finding the channel you had made with the awl, and it emerged on the other side with a soft, scratching sound. You pulled the thread through until a short tail remained. Then you made the second stitch, and the third, working your way along the strap with the same steady, measured pace. Each stitch was pulled tight, but not too tight, just enough to hold the leather firmly without puckering it, and the waxed thread slid through the holes with a faint, pleasant squeaking sound that rose and fell with each pull. The stitches lay flat against the surface, neat and even, a row of pale gold against the dark brown leather, and as you worked, the strap became firmly attached once more, its strength restored. When the last stitch was in place, you tied off the thread with a small, tight knot and trimmed the ends close to the leather with the knife. You ran your thumb over the new stitching, feeling the slight ridge of the thread under your skin, checking that every stitch was secure and evenly tensioned. The repair was strong and clean, the sort of work that would hold for many more months of riding, and you felt a quiet satisfaction as you turned the saddle right side up and set it on the bench before you. But the saddle was not the only piece of tack that needed attention. From the wooden pegs on the wall, you took down a bridle that had been hanging there since the last time it was used, its leather stiff and dry from the cold air. The bridle was a simple design, a headstall with a brow band and noseband, cheek pieces that held the bit rings, and reins that were long and supple, meant to be held in a light, responsive hand. The bit was an iron snaffle, its bars smooth and polished from contact with the horses' mouths, its rings showing a faint patina of rust in the crevices where the metal joined. You laid the bridle on the bench beside the saddle and began to inspect it, running each strap through your fingers, feeling for cracks or weak spots, checking the stitching at every joint. The leather was dry but not cracked, and it responded well to a thorough rubbing with the beeswax mixture. You dipped a clean rag into the pot and worked the wax into the headstall, massaging it into the hide with small circular motions that warmed the leather and opened its pores. The color deepened from a dusty brown to a rich dark chestnut, and the surface took on a soft matte gleam that spoke of well cared for equipment. You worked your way along every strap, the cheek pieces and the noseband and the long reins, and with each pass of the rag, the leather became more supple and pliant, losing the stiffness that had crept in during the cold days. The bit required a different kind of care. You took it to the small bucket of water that stood in the corner of the tack room and dipped it in, swirling it around to loosen the dried saliva and the faint traces of rust. Then you scrubbed it with a handful of clean straw, the coarse stalks acting as a gentle abrasive that removed the surface corrosion without scratching the iron. The bit emerged from the water clean and dark, its rings glinting dully in the grey light, and you dried it thoroughly with a scrap of linen before rubbing it lightly with a cloth that had been dipped in the beeswax, just enough to protect the metal from further rust without making it greasy. When you reassembled the bridle, the leather was soft and the bit was clean, and the whole thing looked ready to be put back into service at a moment's notice. You hung the bridle back on its peg and turned to the other pieces of tack that needed checking. There was a second saddle, this one belonging to the grey mare, its seat narrower and its flaps cut slightly differently to accommodate her smaller frame. You lifted it onto the bench and went through the same inspection, running your hands over the stitching, checking the girth straps, looking at the underside for any sign of wear. This saddle was in better condition than the first, its leather still supple and its stitching intact, but you rubbed a little wax into the seat anyway as a preventative measure, working it into the hide with slow, patient strokes. There were 2 more bridles to check, and you did so, testing the buckles, flexing the leather to see if it cracked, cleaning the bits that had seen less use and needed only a light wipe. Each piece of equipment was handled with the same unhurried attention, the same steady rhythm of inspection and care. The afternoon light through the small window had shifted slightly, the shaft of grey illumination moving across the bench as the sun crept along its hidden path behind the clouds. The work had made your fingers warm and slightly sticky with beeswax, and you paused to wipe them on a rag before picking up the last item on your mental list, a leather girth that had been hanging on a hook near the door. The girth was a wide, padded band of thick hide, its edges bound with a strip of softer leather that had come loose at one corner. You sat down again, threaded the needle with fresh waxed thread, and stitched the binding back into place with small tight stitches that followed the line of the original work. The repair took only a short while, and when it was done, you hung the girth back on its hook and stood up, stretching your arms over your head to ease the slight tightness in your shoulders from leaning over the bench. The tack room looked tidy now, the repaired saddles sitting squarely on the bench, the bridles hanging neatly from their pegs, the tools put away on the shelf. The smell of beeswax and leather hung thickly in the air, warm and comforting, and you stood for a moment in the doorway, looking back into the small, orderly space. The work had been simple and repetitive, the kind of work that required patience more than skill, and you felt the quiet contentment that came from having done it properly. You walked back into the main stable and let your gaze travel along the row of stalls. The horses were still resting, some standing with their heads low, others lying in the straw with their legs folded beneath them. The lamps had burned low again, their flames small and steady in the dimness, and you made a mental note to refill them before the evening. The stable was peaceful, wrapped in the deep hush of a winter afternoon, and the repaired tack waited in its room, ready for the next time the horses were saddled and led out into the snow. For now, though, there was nothing urgent to do, and you pulled the stool out into the aisle, sat down, and let the quiet settle around you like a blanket. The afternoon had arrived with little change in the light, the sky still a smooth pale grey that stretched from horizon to horizon without a single seam or shadow. The snow that had threatened all morning had not yet begun to fall, and the air outside was still and cold and very quiet, the kind of quiet that seems to press against your ears like a soft weight. Inside the stable, the horses had rested for several hours after the midday watering, their breathing slow and deep, their coats warm under the fading lamplight. You had finished the tack repairs and tidied the workbench, and now you stood in the center aisle, considering the afternoon ahead. The horses needed movement. Even in the deepest part of winter, when the ground was frozen and the snow lay thick over the grazing fields, a cavalry mount could not spend every hour standing in a stall. The legs would stiffen, the muscles would grow slack, and the spirit would grow dull. The garrison commander did not require formal training sessions during the cold months, but it was understood that the stable master would see to it that each horse was walked regularly, enough to keep the blood moving and the joints limber. Today, with the sky holding back its snow and the temperature steady, was a good day for such an outing. You walked along the row of stalls, looking at each horse in turn, deciding which two would go out first. The dark bay gelding stood with his usual calm, his head low, his eyes half closed. He was always a good choice for a quiet walk. Beside him, the grey Spanish mare was full of energy, her ears pricked, her tail swishing, and you knew that if you took her out, she would want to move faster than a walk, so you passed her by. The chestnut gelding with the 4 white socks was lying down again, his legs folded beneath him, his blaze bright against the straw, and when you paused at his door, he opened one eye and looked at you with a gentle, drowsy expression. He was a steady, reliable horse, never one to spook or pull, and he would be perfect company for the old bay. You decided on the 2 of them. In the tack room, you lifted the bay gelding's saddle from its rack, the same one you had repaired earlier, its leather now supple and its stitching tight. You also took down his bridle, the bit clean and shining faintly in the dim light. For the chestnut, you chose his own saddle, a slightly wider one to accommodate his broader back, and his bridle with the smooth iron snaffle. You carried the equipment out into the aisle, draping the saddles over the wooden rail that ran along the wall, hanging the bridles by their headstalls from the hooks beside each stall door. Then you went to the bay gelding first. He lifted his head as you unlatched his door, and he stood quietly while you slicked the halter off and replaced it with the bridle, easing the bit between his teeth with a practised motion, settling the headstall over his ears, fastening the throat latch and noseband. The leather was cool against his warm coat, and he champed the bit once, twice, the metal clinking softly, then stood still. You lifted the saddle pad, a thick rectangle of felted wool, and laid it over his back, smoothing it down so that it lay flat and even, the front edge just behind his withers. Then you took the saddle, its weight familiar in your arms, and swung it up onto the pad, settling it gently into place. The girth hung down on the right side, and he walked around the horse, reached under his belly, and pulled the girth up, threading the leather strap through the buckle and drawing it snug, but not tight, just enough to hold the saddle steady. The bay gelding exhaled a long, patient breath, and you patted his shoulder before moving to the chestnut stall. The chestnut had risen to his feet while you were saddling the bay. and he stood with his head over the door, watching you with mild interest. He accepted the bridle without fuss, lowering his head to make it easier for you to slip the crown piece over his ears, and he opened his mouth willingly for the bit. His saddle pad was the same thick grey felt, and you laid it carefully across his back, aligning it with the same practiced eye. The saddle went on easily, the girth fastened with the same steady pull, and then both horses were ready, standing in the aisle with their reins looped loosely over your arm. You pulled your cloak tighter and fastened it securely, then pulled on your gloves, the leather cold against your fingers, despite the warmth of the stable. You checked the girths once more, tightening the bays a single notch, then took a rein in each hand and led the horses towards the main door. The chestnut walked with his head low and his stride slow, his iron shoes scuffing softly on the packed earth. The bay moved with the same easy rhythm, his hips swaying gently, his ears flopping forward and back with each step. Outside, the cold was a solid presence that wrapped around you and squeezed tight. The snow in the yard was still deep, though the path to the training enclosure had been trampled by a few passing feet and was easier to walk along. The training enclosure was a rectangular space at the edge of the fort, bounded by a low wooden fence that was now mostly buried under drifts of snow. Its gate was a simple arrangement of rails that lifted out of their slots, and you removed the top rail and set it aside, then the second, creating an opening wide enough for the horses to pass through. The enclosure itself was a blank expanse of untouched snow, smooth and white and glinting faintly in the grey light, like the surface of a frozen lake. You led the horses inside and replaced the rails behind you, shutting the enclosure off from the rest of the fort. Inside this small fenced world, the silence was even deeper than it had been in the yard, a thick, muffled quiet that absorbed every sound. The snow came up past your ankles, and the horses stepped high through it, their hooves sinking into the soft crust with a crisp, crunching sound that seemed very loud in the stillness. Their breath plumed in great white clouds that hung in the air for a moment before dissolving, and the only other sound was the gentle creak of the saddle leather as they moved, a soft, rhythmic squeaking that rose and fell with each stride. You began to walk them in a wide circle around the perimeter of the enclosure, keeping close to the fence where the snow was slightly shallower. Your boots left deep, crisp prints that filled in slowly with the loose powder kicked up by your heels. The horses walked on either side of you, the bay on your left, the chestnut on your right, their heads bobbing in time with their steps. The bay gelding's dark coat stood out sharply against the white snow, his star shaped like a crescent moon, bright even in the flat light. The chestnut's red-brown coat was warmer in tone, his white socks flashing as he lifted his feet high over the drifts. You walked at a slow, steady pace, not urging the horses on, not holding them back. This was not training in any formal sense. It was simply movement, the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other, of feeling the cold air in the lungs and the snow underfoot. The horses seemed to understand this. The bay plodded along with his head low, his reins slack, his ears flopping lazily with each step. The chestnut walked with a little more spring, his neck slightly arched, his nostrils flaring wide as he breathed in the sharp, clean air. But he did not pull or prance. He kept his pace matched to yours, a steady, companionable walk. You made the first full circuit of the enclosure in silence, the snow crunching underfoot, the saddle leather creaking softly, the horse's breath pluming. At the corner, you turned gently, the horses following the curve without hesitation, their bodies swinging around in a smooth arc. The tracks you left behind you were a neat, continuous line of hoof prints and boot prints, dark holes in the white surface that marked the path you had taken. Ahead of you, the snow lay smooth and untouched, waiting to be marked by the next circuit. On the second circuit, you allowed your gaze to wander beyond the enclosure fence. The fort spread out around you, its buildings dark and solid against the snow, their roofs blanketed in thick white caps. Smoke rose from the chimney of the cookhouse, a thin grey column that went straight up into the still air before bending slightly at the top and dissipating. The palisade walls stood tall and dark, the sharpened tips of the logs poking through the snow like rows of grey teeth. Beyond the walls, the land sloped away in gentle white folds, the trees on the distant hills reduced to black specks against the grey sky. There was no movement anywhere, no sign of life except for the smoke and the two horses and you. The blacksmith's hammer began to ring out from the far side of the fort, a distant metallic clanking that came at irregular intervals. It was a sound you knew well, the rhythm of iron being shaped, and it carried clearly through the cold air, each strike sharp and distinct before fading into the muffled quiet. The hammer rang 3 times, then paused, then rang twice more, and the pattern repeated itself in a sequence that seemed to have no particular logic, but was comforting in its familiarity. The horses paid it no mind, their ears swiveling briefly towards the sound before returning to their relaxed, forward-facing position. You completed the second circuit and started the third. The path you had made was now clearly visible, a wide, oval track of trampled snow that was easier to walk on than the fresh powder. The horses' steps became more assured on the packed surface, their hooves finding the firm footing beneath the snow, and the crunching sound changed to a softer, more muffled thud. The bay gelding stretched his neck down and blew a long, fluttering snort that sent a spray of snow crystals dancing into the air, and the chestnut followed suit a moment later, as if the two of them were sharing some private joke. You kept walking, your pace unchanging, your boots pressing into the familiar indentations of your own earlier tracks. The cold was beginning to make itself felt more insistently now. The tips of your ears stung under your felt cap, and your cheeks were numb where the air touched them. Your toes inside your boots had gone from cold to an absence of sensation that was not quite pain, but was heading in that direction. You wiggled them as you walked, trying to keep the blood moving, and you pulled your cloak a little tighter around your shoulders with your free hand. The horses, with their thick winter coats, seemed untroubled by the temperature. Indeed, they seemed to be enjoying the outing, their steps light and easy, their breath coming in deep, rhythmic gusts. On the fourth circuit, a few snowflakes began to drift down from the grey sky, small and sparse at first, just a scattering of white specks that floated lazily through the air and settled on the horses' manes without melting. You looked up and saw that the sky had grown a shade darker, the grey deepening into something more solid, and you knew that the snow that had held off all morning was finally on its way. The flakes fell slowly, individually, each one tracing its own gentle spiraling path to the ground, and they made no sound at all as they landed. The blacksmith's hammer continued its distant rhythm, the clanks now sounding slightly muffled, as if the falling snow was already beginning to absorb the noise. The horses noticed the snow, of course. The bay lifted his head and blinked, as a flake landed on his eyelashes, and the chestnut turned his head to look at the sky with one dark, questioning eye, his ears pricked forward. But they did not stop walking, and neither did you. The circuit continued, the oval track becoming dusted with a fresh layer of white over the packed snow, the hoof prints gradually softening at the edges. Your own boots were now coated with snow that clung to the leather and refused to be shaken off. You walked for a while longer, not counting the circuits, not measuring the time by any clock but the steady rhythm of your steps and the slow accumulation of snow on your shoulders. The enclosure felt even smaller now, the falling snow creating a kind of white curtain that blurred the edges of the fence and made the world beyond seem very far away. The smoke from the cookhouse chimney was still visible, a grey smear against the grey sky, but the buildings themselves were becoming indistinct, their dark timbers fading into the general whiteness. The hammer had stopped some time ago, and the silence was now complete, except for the soft crunch of your boots and the horse's hooves and the gentle rhythmic creaking of the saddle leather. At last, when the snow had begun to fall more thickly and the cold had settled deep into your bones, you decided it was time to go back inside. You did not stop abruptly or pull on the reins. You simply slowed your pace gradually, letting the horses feel the change in your stride, and then you turned towards the gate. The horses followed willingly, their heads still low, their breath still pluming. The bay gave a small, contented snort, and the chestnut shook his head once, sending the accumulated snowflakes flying from his forelock in a tiny white cloud. You removed the rails from the gate and led the horses through, then replaced them carefully, the wood cold and rough under your gloves. The walk back across the yard was slower than the walk out, the snow now falling in earnest, the flakes larger and denser, filling the air with a soft, swirling whiteness. The stable door was a dark rectangle in the grey wall of the building, and when you pushed it open and led the horses inside, the warmth rushed out to meet you like a living thing, wrapping around your cold face and hands and making your skin prickle as the blood returned. Inside the stable, the lamps were burning low, their flames steady and golden, and the other horses stirred in their stalls at the return of their companions. You led the bay gelding to his stall and removed his saddle and bridle, working with cold stiffened fingers that fumbled a little at the buckles. The saddle leather was cold and slightly damp from the snow, and you wiped it down with a dry rag, before setting it aside to be oiled later. The bay shook himself all over, a full-body shudder that started at his head and rippled back to his tail, sending a fine spray of melting snow into the air. Then he walked to his hayrack and began to eat as if the walk had been nothing more than a brief interruption to his meal. The chestnut received the same treatment, his saddle and bridle removed and wiped down, his coat brushed quickly with your hand to knock off the clinging snow that had not yet melted. He stretched his neck out long and low, arching his back like a cat, then gave a deep rumbling groan of satisfaction and turned in a slow circle before settling into the fresh straw. You checked that both horses had water in their buckets and hay in their racks, and then you stood in the aisle, stamping your feet to bring the feeling back to your toes, rubbing your hands together to warm them. The stable was quiet and warm, filled with the soft sounds of horses eating and breathing, and outside, beyond the thick walls, the snow continued to fall in a steady, silent curtain. You hung the bridles back on their pegs, placed the saddles on their racks, and then sat down on the stool near the door, pulling your cloak around you once more, listening to the peaceful, unchanging rhythm of the winter afternoon. The short winter afternoon had slipped away almost without notice, the grey light through the high window dimming by slow degrees until the stable was filled with a deep blue dusk that gathered in the corners and spread outward like a tide. Outside, the snow had stopped falling some time ago, leaving a fresh layer of white over the yard that reflected the last pale glow of the hidden sun. The air inside the stable had cooled slightly, the warmth of the horses' bodies no longer quite enough to hold back the creeping chill that came with the end of day, and you felt the change on your skin as you rose from the stool and stretched your arms, the tiredness of the afternoon's walking, still a pleasant heaviness in your legs. It was time for the evening feed. The horses knew it too. They had begun to stir in their stalls as the light faded, lifting their heads from the hay racks, their ears pricking forward, their tails giving small expectant swishes. The dark bay gelding with the crescent moon star was watching you with his calm dark eyes, and the grey Spanish mare had already pushed her head over her stall door, her nostrils flaring as she caught the scent of the hay store. The chestnut gelding, back from the afternoon walk, was on his feet again, his white-socked legs planted squarely in the straw, and the tall black stallion stood with his head high, his ears trained on your every movement. Even the old roan, who usually dozed through the late afternoon, had opened his eyes and was looking towards the aisle with quiet expectation. You walked to the lamp brackets and began the ritual of lighting the evening lamps, as you had done in the early morning, only now the flames were needed, not to pierce the pre-dawn darkness, but to hold back the gathering night. The clay lamps were low on oil after burning all day, so you took the flask from its shelf and went from bracket to bracket, topping up each reservoir with the clear, pale oil that smelled faintly of pressed olives, then trimming the wicks with the iron snips so that they burned bright and clean. The flames caught and steadied one by one, their warm orange glow spreading along the aisle, and the shadows retreated to the corners where they belonged. The light reflected in the horse's eyes as small flickering sparks, and it danced across the thatch of the roof, making the cobwebs shine like threads of silver. With the lamps lit, you turned to the hay stall. The heavy wooden door slid open on its greased runners, with the same low rumble it had made in the morning, and the sweet, dusty scent of dried meadow grasses rose up to greet you. The bales were still stacked against the walls, their golden-green blocks dimly visible in the light that followed you in. You chose a bale that was partially broken, its cut end facing outward, and you began to pull handfuls of hay free, working with the same steady rhythm you had used earlier in the day. Reach, pull, place into the basket. Repeat. The hay crackled softly as it separated, stems snapping cleanly, and the loose chaff drifted down to settle on the packed earth floor like a fine golden dust. You filled 2 wide baskets this time, because the evening feed was always a little larger than the morning one, meant to sustain the horses through the long cold night when their bodies would burn the fuel slowly to keep warm. When the baskets were full, you carried them out into the aisle and set them on the floor near the grain cupboard. Then you took the wooden pail and unlocked the cupboard, its door swinging open to reveal the row of clay jars sealed with waxed linen. The crushed barley inside the largest jar was cool and dry against your fingers as you scooped it out with the tin cup, the grains rattling softly against the metal sides, and you measured a slightly larger portion than you had in the morning, mixing it with a handful of the chopped dried apples from the smaller jar. The apples had a sweet, leathery smell that blended with the nuttiness of the grain, and you stirred the mixture with your hand, feeling the textures combine, the rough barley and the slightly sticky apple pieces. You began the feeding at the stall of the old roan gelding, because he was the one who needed the extra warmth of a full belly most of all. His white face turned towards you as you unlatched his door, his cloudy eyes blinking slowly, and he gave a low, wheezy nicker that was full of quiet gratitude. You laid a generous armload of hay into his manger, spreading it so that the softest stems run top where he could reach them easily, and then you poured his portion of grain into the feed bin, the barley and apple mixture making a soft pattering sound against the wood. He lowered his head at once and began to eat, his worn-down teeth working in the slow, deliberate rhythm that was his way. And you stood for a moment watching the muscles of his jaw move under the thin, faded skin, the grey-white hairs of his muzzle twitching as he sorted through the hay for the pieces he liked best. The small pony mare was next, and she greeted you with her usual enthusiasm, her thick mane falling over her eyes as she bobbed her head and snuffled at your sleeve. You gave her a slightly smaller portion than the others, because her round barrel needed less grain to maintain its comfortable curve, but you added an extra handful of the apple pieces as a treat, and she licked them up eagerly, her whiskers brushing your palm in a ticklish dance. Her hay went into the manger with a soft rustle, and she fell to eating with the single-minded focus that only a pony can manage, her whole body radiating contentment. The tall black stallion received his feed with the same dignified restraint he showed in all things, waiting until you had stepped back from his stall before lowering his great head to the manger. You watched him select a single stem of hay, draw it into his mouth, and begin to chew with a slow, meditative motion, his dark eyes half closed in the lamplight, the glossy black of his coat reflecting the flames like a deep pool of water. The grain he ate with the same measured pace, each mouthful ground thoroughly before he swallowed, and the only sign of his pleasure was the faint, steady swish of his tail against the stall partition. The dark bay gelding, the grey Spanish mare, the chestnut, and the dappled grey all received their portions in turn. The bay ate with his usual calm reliability, his head bobbing slightly as he worked through the hay, his crescent moon star catching the light. The grey mare picked out the clover heads first, as she always did, her delicate nostrils flaring as she sorted the sweetest pieces from the pile, and then she fell to the grain with rapid, precise bites. The chestnut buried his white-blazed face in the feed bin and came up with barley dust on his nose, which made you smile as you wiped it off with your thumb. The dappled grey ate with a quiet, undemanding steadiness, his jaws moving in a rhythm that matched the gentle sway of his body as he shifted his weight from side to side. The young dun gelding still showed a trace of his morning nervousness, circling his stall once before approaching the feed, but once he began to eat, his anxiety faded, and he stood with one hind leg cocked, his pale brown coat looking dusty gold in the lamplight. With the hay and grain distributed, the stable filled with the sound of munching, a soft, continuous chorus of grinding teeth and pulling lips, and the occasional low snort of satisfaction. It was the sound of horses settling into the evening, a sound as old and as comforting as the crackling of a fire or the murmur of a stream, and you paused in the aisle to listen to it, your hands resting on your hips, your breath coming slow and easy. The lamps burned steadily, their flames reflected in the dark glass of the oil reservoirs, and the shadows they cast were soft-edged and gentle. When the grain was finished, and the horses had turned their full attention to the hay, you took up the pail and went to the water buckets. The buckets had been refilled after the midday watering, but the horses had drunk from them throughout the afternoon, and the levels had dropped by varying amounts. You lifted each bucket from its hook and carried it to the large clay amphora in the corner, tilting the heavy vessel to pour fresh water in a clear, cold stream that gurgled and splashed against the wooden sides. The water was so cold it made your fingers ache even through your gloves, and you worked quickly, filling each bucket to within a handspan of the brim before hanging it back on its hook. The dark bay gelding drank immediately, his muzzle dipping into the bucket with a soft splash, and the grey mare followed suit a moment later, her long, elegant neck stretching down as she sipped at the fresh water with delicate, precise mouthfuls. The chestnut drank deeply, his throat working invisible swallows, and the black stallion waited until the water had settled before lowering his head and taking long, slow draughts that made the level drop steadily. The pony mare, as always, sloshed a little water over the side of her bucket in her eagerness, and you wiped the spill with a handful of straw before moving on. The buckets were all full, the water dark and still in the lamplight, and the horses had drunk their fill. The sound of eating had softened now, the first hunger satisfied, and the horses were working through their hay at a more leisurely pace, picking out the choicest stems and leaving the coarser ones for later. The stable was warm and close, the air thick with the mingled smells of hay and grain and horses, and the night outside pressed against the walls like a cold, dark blanket. You took a few moments to check the bedding in each stall, walking from one to the next with a lantern in your hand. The fresh straw you had laid down that morning was still clean and dry in most places, but a few of the horses had kicked it around or lain down and flattened it, leaving bare patches where the stone floor showed through. You gathered armloads of fresh straw from the store and topped up these stalls, spreading the golden stalks over the thin spots, building up the bed so that each horse would have a warm, soft place to rest through the night. The old roan's stall needed the most attention, as it always did. He had lain down several times during the day, and his bed was flattened and scattered. You brought 3 armloads of straw and worked it into a deep, soft layer, paying special attention to the corner where he always curled up, piling the straw into a thick mound that would cushion his old bones against the cold stone. He was still eating his hay, but he paused to watch you with his cloudy eyes, and you patted his neck gently before leaving him to his meal. The young dun gelding's stall also needed extra straw, because he had paced in a circle for part of the afternoon and worn a path through the bedding. You spread a fresh layer over the packed track, smoothing it down with your hands, and the dun watched this with his head tilted, his ears swiveling back and forth as if trying to understand the purpose of your work. When you were done, he stepped forward and sniffed at the new straw, then gave a tentative little buck that kicked up a few stalks, his nervous energy finally released in a harmless burst of playfulness. The last of the hay was being eaten now, and the horses were beginning to settle. The chestnut gelding had finished his feed and was already lying down in his deep bed, his legs folded under him, his white socked feet tucked neatly against his belly. His eyes were closed and his breathing was slow and even, the steady rise and fall of his barrel visible in the dim light. The dark bay gelding was still standing, but his head was low, his lower lip drooping, and you knew he would lie down soon. The grey mare had turned herself around in her stall so that she faced the door, her silver-grey coat glowing softly in the lamplight, and she stood with one hind leg cocked, her expression peaceful. The black stallion remained on his feet, as he often did at this hour, his head high and his ears moving in slow circles as he listened to the sounds of the stable. A silent guardian over the sleeping herd. You took the lantern and walked the length of the stable, checking the doors and the shutters. The main door was already closed and latched. Its heavy iron bolts slid firmly into place, but you put your shoulder against it to test the seal, feeling the cold air that tried to seep through the gaps around the frame. The wood was solid, and the bolt held fast, so you moved on. The small rear door that led to the midden yard was also shut, and you checked its latch as well, lifting the iron hook and letting it drop into its catch with a satisfying clink. The windows were your next concern. The stable had 3 of them, the high one at the far end that faced east, and 2 smaller ones set into the side walls, their openings covered not with glass but with wooden shutters that could be closed against the wind. The shutters were made of thick oak planks, their edges beveled to fit snugly into the frames, and they were held shut by iron hooks that caught into rings set into the wall. You closed them one by one, starting with the high east window, which you reached by climbing the short ladder that leaned against the wall near the hayloft. The shutter swung inward on its leather hinges, and you pushed it firmly into place, feeling the cold night air give way to the warmth inside. The hook dropped into its ring with a soft metallic scrape, and you climbed down and moved to the next one. The 2 side shutters were easier to reach, set at chest height, and you closed them in turn, working the hooks into their rings, sealing out the darkness and the cold. With each shutter closed, the stable became a little more enclosed, a little more separate from the world outside, until it felt like a small, warm island adrift in a sea of winter night. The only connection to the outside was the thin line of cold air that still found its way under the door and through the tiny gaps in the thatch, but even that was barely noticeable against the warmth rising from the horses. You returned to the center aisle and set the lantern on the low wooden table, then walked slowly along the row of stalls, saying a silent good night to each horse in turn. The dark bay gelding had finally lain down, his legs folded beneath him, his crescent moon star just visible above the straw. The grey mare was still standing, but her eyes were closed and her breathing was deep and slow, the breath moving through her nostrils with a soft, rhythmic whisper. The chestnut gelding slept on, undisturbed, and the black stallion had shifted his weight and lowered his head, though his eyes remained half open, watchful even in rest. The pony mare was a round, dark hump in the straw, her thick mane falling over her face, and the dappled grey was stretched out on his side, his dapples lost in the dim light. The young dun stood with his head hanging low, his ears flopping sideways, and the old roan was curled in his deep bed, his breathing faint but steady, his body a warm, living presence in the quiet stall. You stopped at his door for a moment, looking in at the old horse, and you felt the weight of the day settling over you like a familiar blanket. The stable was as it should be, warm, quiet, safe, filled with the soft sounds of sleeping animals and the golden glow of the lamps. You reached up and dimmed the nearest lamp, pinching the wick until the flame was a small steady bead of light, and then you did the same to the others, leaving just enough illumination to see by if any of the horses stirred during the night. The shadows deepened around you, and the stable fell into a kind of half-darkness that was not frightening but peaceful, a twilight rest that would hold until the morning. You pulled the stool close to the door and sat down, drawing your cloak around your shoulders, and you listened to the night. The wind had risen slightly outside, a low moan that curled around the corners of the building and whispered through the eaves. But inside the stable, the air was still and calm. The horses breathed in their stalls, a slow collective rhythm that was as steady as the tide, and the lamps flickered softly in the gentle draught that came from somewhere high in the roof. You sat there for a long time, not moving, not thinking, just being present in the quiet, letting the peace of the stable wrap around you, like the warmth from the horses' bodies, holding the winter night at bay until the slow arrival of another dawn. The evening feed was finished, the water buckets filled, the shutters closed, and the stable had settled into the deep quiet of early night. You stood in the center aisle for a long moment, listening to the soft, steady breathing of the horses as they rested in their stalls, their bellies full and their beds deep and dry. The lamps had been dimmed to small, steady beads of light that barely pushed back the shadows, and the air was warm and still, heavy with the mingled smells of hay and grain and the clean animal warmth of the horses themselves. Outside, the wind had begun to rise, a low, distant moan that curled around the corners of the fort and whispered through the chinks in the stable walls. But inside, the world was small and safe and quiet. You walked to the wooden chest near the tack room door, where a heavy wool blanket was kept folded during the day. The blanket was thick and dark, woven from the coarse wool of the garrison's own sheep, and it smelled faintly of lanolin and cedar from the chest it lived in. You shook it out, the folds falling open with a soft, heavy rustle, and then you wrapped it around your shoulders, pulling it close at the throat. The weight of it settled over you like a second cloak, and you felt the warmth begin to build almost immediately, your body heat trapped against the wool in a small, private pocket of comfort. Near the main door, there was a simple wooden bench, its planks worn smooth by years of use, its legs slightly uneven on the packed earth floor. You sat down on it, adjusting the blanket so that it covered your legs as well as your shoulders, and you leaned back against the timber wall, feeling the solidity of the old wood behind you. The bench was not uncomfortable. It had been shaped, intentionally or not, by the bodies that had sat on it through many winter nights, and it cradled you in a way that was almost restful. You stretched your legs out slightly, crossing your ankles, and let your hands rest in your lap under the warmth of the blanket. The lamp nearest the door was burning with a low orange flame that danced gently in the almost imperceptible draught that came from under the door. You watched it for a while, the way the flame leaned slightly to one side and then straightened, the way its reflection flickered on the iron bracket that held it, the way the shadows it cast moved across the wall in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. The flame was a living thing in the quiet stable, the only thing that moved with any purpose, and its light was a small, warm presence that kept the deepest darkness at bay. Beyond its glow, the stable stretched away into shadow, the stalls dim and indistinct, the horses reduced to dark shapes, and the occasional glint of an eye catching the light. The first hour of the night watch passed in a kind of suspended stillness. You listened to the sounds of the stable, the many small noises that made up the fabric of the night, the steady, rhythmic breathing of the horses, each at its own pace, some slow and deep, others lighter and quicker. The occasional soft snort as a horse cleared its nostrils, the quiet rustle of straw as a heavy body shifted weight, or a tail swished lazily against a flank. These sounds blended together into a continuous, soothing murmur that filled the air like the sound of a distant stream. And you let your mind drift on it, not thinking about anything in particular, just being present in the warmth and the quiet. The wind outside was the only voice from the world beyond the walls. It moaned under the eaves with a low, hollow note that rose and fell in slow cycles, and sometimes it gusted against the shutters, making the timbers creak and the leather hinges strain with a faint, leathery groan. The thatch overhead rustled too, a soft, dry sound like 1,000 tiny whispers, as the wind combed through the straw and found its way through the small gaps in the roofing. But these sounds were distant, muted by the thick walls and the deep layer of hay and the sheer, solid presence of the horses, and they did not disturb the peace of the stable. Rather, they seemed to emphasize it, to make the warmth and stillness inside feel even more secure by contrast. After a time, you rose from the bench, moving slowly and carefully so as not to startle any of the horses who might be sleeping lightly. The blanket slipped from one shoulder, and you pulled it back into place, holding it closed with one hand as you walked to the nearest lamp bracket. You lifted the lamp down, the clay warm against your palm, and you held it before you as you began a slow circuit of the stable. This was the first check of the night, a routine that you would repeat several times before dawn, and it was not a hurried inspection, but a slow, gentle wandering from stall to stall, a quiet reassurance that all was well. The lamp's small flame threw a circle of orange light that moved with you, illuminating the packed earth of the aisle and the lower rails of the stall doors, leaving the upper reaches of the stable in shadow. You passed the first stall, where the dark bay gelding lay stretched out in the deep straw, his crescent moon star just visible as a pale patch on his forehead. His breathing was deep and even, his barrel rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm, and one of his ears flicked once as the light passed over him, a brief acknowledgment of your presence before he sank back into sleep. You did not stop, only noted the peacefulness of his rest, and you moved on. The grey Spanish mare was standing in her stall, her silver-grey coat glowing softly in the lamplight, but her eyes were closed and her head was low, her lower lip drooping in the slackness of sleep. Horses could sleep standing, locking their legs so that they would not fall, and she had chosen to do so tonight, her weight evenly balanced on all 4 feet, her breathing soft and slow. The light touched her mane, picking out the individual strands of dark grey and white, and she did not stir at all as you passed. Her hay rack was nearly empty, a few stray stems clinging to the wooden bars, and you made a mental note to add more hay when you did the final check before dawn. The chestnut gelding with the 4 white socks was lying flat on his side, his legs stretched out, his white blaze barely visible against the dark shape of his head. He was so deeply asleep that his breathing made a faint, rumbling sound with each exhale, a soft snore that was almost endearing in its peacefulness. The straw around him was flattened into a nest that cradled his body, and the warmth of his coat seemed to radiate outward, filling the stall with a gentle, living heat. You paused at his door for a moment, watching the slow rise and fall of his ribs, and then you continued on. The tall black stallion was awake, his great dark head turned towards you as you approached, his eyes catching the lamplight and reflecting it back as 2 small glowing sparks. He did not move otherwise, standing with his usual erect posture, his neck arched, his ears pricked forward. The stallion was the watcher of the herd, the one who rarely lay down the one who seemed to carry a kind of quiet vigilance even in the darkest hours of the night. You met his gaze for a long moment, and then you gave him a slight nod, a silent greeting that acknowledged his role as much as your own. He blinked once, slowly, and then turned his head away, as if satisfied that all was in order. The small pony mare was a round, dark hump in her straw, her shaggy coat blending into the bedding so that she looked almost like a boulder covered in moss. She was lying down, her short legs tucked under her barrel, her thick mane falling over her closed eyes. Her breathing was quick and light, the breath of a smaller animal, and it made a faint, whistling sound as it passed through her nostrils. You smiled slightly at the sight of her, the way her round belly rose and fell, the way her whiskers twitched as she dreamed some pony dream of summer grass or stolen apples. The dappled grey gelding was also lying down, his legs folded neatly beneath him, his grey coat marked with its darker spots that looked like shadows of leaves on a forest floor. He stirred slightly as the lamplight reached him, lifting his head and blinking sleepily, but when he saw that it was only you, he lowered his head again and closed his eyes, a long, slow sigh escaping his nostrils. The young dun gelding was standing in his usual corner, his pale brown coat looking dusty in the dim light, but he was relaxed, one hind leg cocked, his ears flopping sideways. He had grown calmer over the weeks of winter, and now he only flicked an ear as you passed, no longer pressing himself against the wall in nervousness. At the final stall, the old roan gelding lay in his deep bed, his white-grey face peaceful in sleep. His breathing was faint but steady, a soft whispery sound that was almost lost under the other noises of the stable. You stood at his door for a little longer than you had at the others, looking at the old horse who had been your companion through many winters, and you listened to the slow, fragile rhythm of his breath. The straw around him was thick and soft, piled high in the corner where his head rested, and his body was curved into a gentle crescent, his legs tucked in, his tail draped over his flank. Satisfied that he was comfortable, you moved on, the lamp dipping as you walked. You completed the circuit and returned to the bench by the door, hanging the lamp back on its bracket and settling yourself under the blanket once more. The brief walk had loosened the slight stiffness in your legs, and the cold that had crept into your fingers from holding the lamp slowly faded as you tucked your hands under the wool. You leaned your head back against the wall and let your eyes close, though you did not sleep. You simply rested, floating in that space between waking and dreaming, where the sounds of the stable became a kind of music, a lulling, repetitive melody that had no beginning and no end. The second hour of the watch drifted past in this way, the stable unchanging, the wind outside rising and falling in its slow, mournful cycles. Once a gust of wind blew strongly enough that the thatch above you rustled loudly, and a few bits of dried straw sifted down through the rafters, landing on the floor with a soft patter. The horses stirred briefly at the sound, a few of them lifting their heads and snorting, but the moment passed quickly, and the stillness returned. You opened your eyes and looked around, but there was nothing amiss, only the same quiet scene of sleeping animals and dim lamplight and shadows that never quite stilled. Later, much later, you rose again for the second check of the night. The lamp had burned a little lower, the flame smaller and more amber now, and you lifted it carefully, shielding the flame with your hand as you walked. The stable was in the deepest part of the night, that time when even the wind seemed to hold its breath, and the silence was so complete that you could hear the very faint, distant sound of your own heartbeat. The horses were all deeply asleep now, even the stallion, who had finally lowered his head and closed his eyes, though he still stood rather than lying down. The dark bay gelding had shifted in his sleep, turning onto his other side, and the grey mare had lain down at last, her long legs folded under her silver body. The chestnut was still snoring softly, his white socked feet twitching occasionally as he dreamed, and the old roan had not moved at all, his breathing unchanged, his rest undisturbed. You walked the same slow circuit, pausing at each stall, listening to the breathing, noting the positions of the horses, making sure that no bucket had been tipped over, that no straw had been kicked into a water bucket, that no horse was showing any sign of restlessness or discomfort. Everything was as it should be, as it had been 100 nights before, and would be 100 nights again. The stable was a place of deep peace, a small island of warmth and calm in the vast cold darkness of the winter night. In your presence was the quiet reassurance that all was well, that someone was watching, that the horses could sleep without fear. The hours between midnight and dawn were the longest of the watch, the time when the night seemed to stretch out endlessly, and the darkness outside was at its most complete. You sat on the bench, the blanket wrapped around you, and you let your thoughts drift where they would, not holding on to any one idea for long. Sometimes you thought of the summer pastures, the green hills beyond the fort where the horses would graze when the snow finally melted, the sound of bees in the clover, the warmth of the sun on your back. Sometimes you thought of nothing at all, simply listening to the breathing of the horses and the slow creak of the stable timbers settling in the cold. The lamp burned on, its flame a tiny constant companion, and the shadows it cast moved across the walls in a slow, silent dance. A third check, in the small hours when the darkness outside was just beginning to soften at its very edges, though dawn was still a long way off. You rose stiffly, your muscles cold despite the blanket, and you walked the aisle once more. The horses were beginning to stir now, not fully awake, but shifting in their sleep, the first subtle signs that the long night was approaching its end. The dark bay gelding was on his feet again, standing with his head low, dozing on his legs. The grey mare was also up, her eyes half open, her ears swivelling lazily. The chestnut had rolled onto his other side and was still sleeping, and the stallion had lifted his head and was looking towards the door, as if sensing the distant approach of morning. The pony mare had not moved, a round, warm lump in her straw, and the old roan was still curled in his nest, his breathing steady and slow. You checked the water buckets, breaking the thin film of ice that had formed on the surface of each one, the ice cracking softly under the pressure of your finger. You added a handful of hay to the racks that were nearly empty, the dry stems rustling as you laid them in place. You adjusted a saddle pad that had slipped from its peg in the tack room, hanging it straight again. These were small, quiet tasks, done without hurry, without noise, and they filled the last hour of the watch with a gentle, purposeful rhythm. Finally you returned to the bench and sat down, the blanket wrapped close around you, and you watched the high window at the far end of the stable, where the faintest possible grey was beginning to show through the cracks in the shutters. The dawn was still some time away, but the quality of the darkness had changed, the deep, solid black of midnight giving way to a softer, bluer darkness that held the promise of light. The horses sensed it too. There was a new alertness in their ears, a subtle quickening of their breathing, as if they knew that the day was on its way. But for now, the stable was still a place of rest, and you sat quietly waiting, watching, keeping the night watch until the first true light of morning arrived. The last hour passed as the others had, in a slow dream-like drift of half-thoughts and quiet observations, the lamp burning low, the wind dying away to nothing, the cold outside pressing against the walls but unable to enter. You were the guardian of this small, warm world, and you would remain so until the dawn came and the new day's routines began again. The same cycles of feeding and watering and grooming and mucking out that had filled all the days before, and would fill all the days before, and would fill all the days to come. The last hours of the night had passed in a slow, dreamlike drift, the stable wrapped in a darkness so deep it seemed to have its own weight and texture, pressing gently against the dim glow of the single lamp that still burned near the door. You had risen from the bench 3 times during the watch to walk the aisle and check on the horses, and each time you had found them resting peacefully, their breathing steady, their bodies warm in the deep straw. Now, as you sat with the heavy wool blanket pulled close around your shoulders, you felt a subtle change in the air, a barely perceptible shift in the quality of the darkness that told you the night was beginning to loosen its grip. The high window at the far end of the stable, its shutters still closed tight against the cold, showed the faintest possible lightening along its lower edge, a thin line of grey so pale it was almost not there at all. It was the kind of light that arrives long before the sun, a slow, seeping illumination that seems to rise from the snow itself, and it meant that dawn was still some time away, but was no longer an impossibility. The horses sensed it too. You heard a soft rustle of straw as the dark bay gelding shifted in his stall, and from somewhere further down the row came a low, rumbling sigh, the sound of a horse waking from a deep sleep and considering whether to rise. You pushed the blanket back slowly, feeling the cold air of the stable touch your face and hands, and you stood up from the bench with the careful, deliberate movements of someone who had been sitting still for a long time. Your legs were stiff despite the warmth of the wool, and you stretched them gently, rolling your shoulders and flexing your fingers to bring the blood back to the surface. The lamp on its bracket had burned very low, its flame now no more than a small wavering bead of blue and orange that barely illuminated the iron hook it hung from. You lifted it down and trimmed the wick with the iron snips, then added a little oil from the flask, the liquid gurgling softly into the clay reservoir, and the flame steadied and brightened, pushing the shadows back a few more inches. It was time for the final check of the night, the last circuit of the stable before the morning routines began. You lifted the lamp and began to walk, your boots making only the softest whisper against the packed earth floor. The horses were in that state between sleep and waking, some still lying down, others on their feet, but with their heads low and their eyes half closed, and they acknowledged your passing with small, quiet signs, a flicked ear, a twitch of a nostril, a tail that lifted briefly and then settled back against a flank. The dark bay gelding was standing now, his crescent moon star pale in the dim light, and he turned his head to watch you with his calm, dark eyes, the same patient gaze he had given you 1,000 times before. You paused at his stall and reached over the door to touch his neck, feeling the warmth of his coat and the slow, steady pulse under the skin, and he leaned into the touch for a moment before turning back to his hayrack. The grey Spanish mare was lying down, her long legs folded under her silver body, her mane spread across the straw like a dark river. She did not stir as the lamplight fell across her, only the gentle rise and fall of her barrel showing that she lived, and you let the light linger on her for a moment before moving on. The chestnut gelding with the 4 white socks was also still asleep, stretched flat on his side, his white blazed face resting on a pillow of straw, his breathing making that faint, rumbling snore that you had come to know so well. The tall black stallion was awake, as you had expected, standing with his head high and his ears pricked towards the high window, and he gave you a single slow blink as you passed, a silent communication that all was well. The small pony mare was a warm round shape in her deep bed, her thick mane covering her face, her short legs completely hidden by the straw, and the dappled grey gelding was curled neatly in his corner, his spotted coat barely visible in the shadows. The young dun stood with one hind leg cocked, his head low, his eyes closed, so deeply relaxed that he did not react at all to the light, and the old roan gelding was exactly where he had been all night, his white-grey face peaceful, his breathing slow and fragile and steady. With the horses checked and found comfortable, you turned your attention to the small tasks that always waited at the end of the night. The aisle, which had been clean when you sat down, had acquired a thin scattering of hay and straw during the dark hours, the inevitable result of horses shifting and eating and moving in their stalls. You set the lamp on the low wooden table and took up the birch broom, its twig bristles stiff and slightly curved from long use, and you began to sweep the aisle with slow, even strokes. The broom made a soft, scratching sound against the packed earth, a sound that was gentle and repetitive and almost musical in the quiet of the stable, and the scattered stalks gathered into a small, neat pile that you worked steadily towards the door. You did not hurry. The sweeping was a peaceful task, a way of putting the night to rest and preparing the stable for the new day, and you let the rhythm of the broom carry you along the length of the aisle until the floor was clean and the pile of sweepings was gathered at the threshold. You scooped it up with your hands and dropped it into the straw cart, where it would join the rest of the used bedding on the midden heap later in the morning. The water buckets were your next concern. During the long night, the cold had crept into the stable despite the warmth of the horses, and as you went from stall to stall, you saw that each bucket wore a thin, transparent skin of ice across its surface, as delicate as a pane of glass. You lifted the first bucket from its hook, the metal handle cold even through your leather glove, and you carried it to the door where the lamplight was strongest. The ice was so thin that it bent slightly under the weight of the water beneath, and you broke it with a gentle tap of your knuckle, the ice shattering into 100 tiny shards that tinkled against the wooden sides like the sound of distant bells. You swirled the bucket once to mix the water, then hung it back on its hook, and the dark bay gelding lowered his head at once and drank, his long, slow sips making the water level drop in small, rhythmic increments. You repeated the process for each horse, moving from stall to stall with the same unhurried patience, breaking the ice, swirling the buckets, hanging them back in place. The grey mare drank with her usual delicate precision, her silver muzzle barely disturbing the surface. The chestnut gulped thirstily, his throat working invisible swallows. The black stallion waited until you had stepped back before lowering his great head, his drinking a slow, dignified ritual. The pony mare sloshed water over the side of her bucket in her eagerness, and you wiped the spill with a handful of straw. The dappled grey and the young dun drank in their turn, And finally the old roan, who you had helped to his feet for the drink, stood on his creaking legs and took long, slow draughts that seemed to give him a new measure of strength. When the buckets were all clear of ice and the horses had drunk, you walked to the small rear door that led to the midden yard and unlatched it, pushing it open just wide enough to look outside. The cold air rushed in like a wave, sharp and clean and so fresh it made your lungs ache with the first breath. But it was not the same bitter, penetrating cold of the deep night. This was a different kind of cold, a still, quiet cold that seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the sun. The snow had stopped falling at some point during the night, and the yard lay under a fresh, smooth layer of white that was so pristine it seemed almost luminous in the pre-dawn darkness. The clouds that had hung over the fort all day and all evening had thinned and broken apart, and through the gaps a few stars were visible, small and distant and very white against the retreating blackness. One star, brighter than the others, hung low in the east, just above the dark line of the palisade, and you stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at it, feeling the cold air on your face and the warmth of the stable at your back. The fort around you was completely silent. The watchman on the wall had finished his rounds some time ago, and the garrison soldiers were still asleep in their barracks, wrapped in their own blankets against the cold. No smoke rose from the cookhouse chimney, no hammer rang from the forge, no voice called out across the yard. The world was suspended in that perfect, breathless stillness that comes just before dawn, when the night has lost its darkness, but the day has not yet arrived and everything seems to be waiting. The fresh snow on the ground reflected the faint starlight, giving the yard a soft, ghostly glow that made the familiar shapes of the buildings seem new and strange, as if you were seeing them for the first time. You pulled the door closed again, gently, letting the latch fall into place with a soft click, and you turned back to the warm, golden dimness of the stable. The lamp still burned on its table, its flame steady now, and the horses had settled back into their resting positions, their thirst quenched, their bodies warm. You walked to the bench and sat down, pulling the blanket around you once more, but you did not lean back and close your eyes this time. Instead, you sat upright, your hands folded in your lap, and you let your gaze travel around the stable, taking in every detail, the worn wooden posts that supported the roof, the cobwebs that hung in the rafters, the tools that rested in their places by the wall, the row of dark stall doors with the familiar shapes of the horses just visible beyond them. This was your world, this small enclosed space of warmth and hay and living creatures, and you knew every inch of it as well as you knew your own hands. The grey light at the high window was growing slowly, the thin line of paleness spreading upward and outward as the minutes passed, though it was still far too early for the sun to show itself. The quality of the darkness inside the stable changed with it, the shadows softening at their edges, the lamp's glow losing its dominance and becoming just one source of light among many. You could see the horses more clearly now, the colours of their coats beginning to emerge from the grey, the dark bay's rich brown, the Spanish mare's silver sheen, the chestnut's red warmth, the black stallion's glossy darkness, the pony's shaggy dun, the dappled grey's subtle spots, the young dun's dusty pale, the old roan's faded mix of white and rust. Each horse was a distinct personality, a separate life that you had come to know intimately over the months and years, and you felt a quiet, wordless affection for each of them as you sat there in the growing light. The first true sign of dawn was a subtle one. A single bird called somewhere outside, a brief tentative chirp that cut through the silence and then vanished. It was joined a moment later by another, and then another, until a thin chorus of birdsong was rising from the thatch of the stable roof, the small hidden creatures greeting the coming day in their own language. The horses heard it too. Several of them lifted their heads, their ears pricking forward, and the chestnut gelding gave a low, rumbling nicker that seemed to be a response to the birds. The stable was waking up slowly, gently, without any hurry, and you felt the last of the night's drowsiness lift from your own mind as the world prepared to turn once more. You rose from the bench and folded the blanket, laying it neatly in the wooden chest, where it would wait for the next night. Then you walked to each lamp bracket in turn and extinguished the flames, pinching the wicks between your thumb and forefinger, the last curls of smoke rising like tiny black threads before fading into the air. The stable was now lit only by the natural grey of the pre-dawn, a soft, diffuse illumination that was gentler even than the lamplight, and the horses stood in their stalls like figures in a painting, still and calm and beautiful. At the hay store, you checked the bales to make sure there was enough for the morning feed, and you broke open a fresh bale, the compressed stalks springing apart with a sweet dusty scent that mingled with the cool air. You forked a little hay into each rack where the supply had run low during the night, the stems rustling as they fell into place, and the horses began to eat at once, their jaws working in the slow, steady rhythm that was the heartbeat of the stable. You refilled the clay amphora from the small barrel of water that stood near the door, the water sloshing and gurgling as it poured, and you set it back in its corner, ready for the day ahead. When everything was prepared, you walked to the main stable door and unlatched it, pushing it open a little way so that you could stand in the doorway and look out at the fort. The sky in the east was now a pale, pearly grey, streaked with faint bands of rose and gold that told of the sun's approach below the horizon. The snow on the ground reflected the colours, taking on a soft, warm glow that made the whole yard seem to be blushing, and the dark shapes of the buildings stood out against it in sharp relief. The air was cold but still, the wind having died away completely, and the only sound was the chorus of birds in the thatch above you and the distant muffled crowing of the garrison's rooster from somewhere near the cookhouse. Smoke was beginning to rise from the chimney there, a thin, straight column of grey that climbed into the pale sky, and you knew that the cooks were stirring, lighting the fires for the morning bread. You stood in the doorway for a while, letting the cold air wash over you, watching the slow transformation of the world from night to day. A soldier emerged from the barracks, his cloak pulled tight, and walked towards the latrines, his boots leaving a line of dark prints in the fresh snow. The watchman on the wall changed shifts, two figures meeting briefly at the corner tower before one climbed down and the other took his place, the iron-shod staff tapping against the frozen walkway in a slow, steady beat. The garrison was waking, the fort coming back to life after the long night, and you felt a quiet sense of belonging, a knowledge that you were part of this slow, reliable rhythm, as much a fixture of the fort as the palisade walls or the stone well in the yard. When the cold began to bite at your cheeks and the tips of your ears, you stepped back inside and closed the door, leaving it unlatched so that the other stable hands could enter when they arrived. The stable was warm and bright now, the grey morning light filling every corner, the horses eating their hay with contented rhythmic chewing, and you walked to the centre aisle and stood there, your hands on your hips, surveying the peaceful scene. The night watch was over. The horses had passed through the darkness safely, wrapped in the warmth of their straw and the steady presence of one